Government Business Order of the Day number 1, standing in the name of Ms Boothby, the Domestic and Family Violence and Victims Legislation Amendment Bill 2025, Serial 22, to move the bill be read a second time.
Madam Speaker, I move the bill be read a second time.
I call the next speaker, Opposition Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. No Territorian should ever have their safety threatened. Not at home, not in public, not anywhere. And certainly not by someone who claims to love them. Domestic, family and sexual violence is rising across Australia, Madam Speaker, but nowhere has its increase been as sharp or sustained or devastating as here in the Northern Territory. This crisis demands more than statements. It demands real leadership. As members of this Assembly, we must stand together, united, in condemning domestic, family and sexual violence in the strongest possible terms across the Territory. We all know the devastating headlines. We all know the faces that have been affected. Too many Territory women and Territory children and Territory families have been devastated by violence from someone that they once or still do trust. These are not just stories, Madam Speaker. They are shattered lives, grieving communities and a system struggling to cope to support. Madam Speaker, domestic, family and sexual violence is not confined by a postcode, by someone's income or their background. It is a widespread, life-threatening issue across the Territory, and we all must do better to stamp it out. And Madam Speaker, I believe that we can. And while the Labor opposition supports some of the amendments that are provided in this bill, particularly around victims register and notifications, we cannot and do not support the mandatory sentencing provisions. And Madam Speaker, that's because we've been listening to the experts, those from the frontline services who deal, unfortunately, day to day with the devastating impact of domestic violence, those organisations and individuals who made submissions to the scrutiny committee process for this particular piece of legislation before the House. Madam Speaker, there were 21 submissions as part of the inquiry by the committee. Every single one of the 21 submissions opposed mandatory sentencing. And it is hard to know if the Attorney-General bothered to read the Scrutiny Committee report, all the 21 submissions, but given that she is forging ahead, as far as we can tell today, because often we don't get told what legislation is happening until the very last minute, but she is forging ahead today, Madam Speaker, because in the current form, the legislation today does not take on the expert advice, and particularly from those organisations who provided in their submissions. Madam Speaker, the Attorney-General either doesn't care or doesn't know from anybody who's working in the field that says domestic violence and mandatory sentencing does not solve the problem. In many submissions, they said, Madam Speaker, in fact, it unfortunately can exacerbate the problem when it comes to domestic violence and sexual violence in the Northern Territory. And Madam Speaker, we see the CLP government making this particular choice and putting the lives of Territorians at risk by making this choice in the legislation. Every single domestic violence service provider, Madam Speaker, is against the mandatory sentencing provision that is in this legislation. Every single legal expert is against the mandatory sentencing position in this legislation. Every frontline advocate who has made a submission to the Legislative Scrutiny Committee told the CLP government not to proceed with the bill in its current form. Every single one. Unfortunately, Madam Speaker, as far as we know today and this morning, those experts' voices have been ignored. The committee chair, the member for 𝑨𝑮𝑻, has rubber-stamped it on behalf of the government, despite the huge call from those experts to remove the mandatory sentencing provision from this bill. Madam Speaker, no public hearings were held when it comes to this legislation, and all of us in this chamber, all 25 members of this chamber, absolutely know that every single day that a Territorian is affected by domestic and family and sexual violence in the Northern Territory, it affects all of our electorates and all of the communities we represent in it. But no public hearings were held by the committee. No direct consultation with victim survivors and the very people affected by this legislation. Madam Speaker, even the Attorney-General's own department could not provide data or evidence that this bill will make a positive difference when it comes to the mandatory sentencing provision. So let's be very clear what's happened here, Madam Speaker. The CLP government ignores expert advice. The CLP government blocks Territorians from speaking out. The CLP government fails to provide any evidence and data to prove otherwise, and the CLP government has decided to push forward with this very element anyway. That's not leadership, Madam Speaker. That is negligence. Madam Speaker, here is what some of those submitting had to say about this bill. Australia's national research organisation for women's safety said, and I quote, "Our primary value to our stakeholders is our understanding of the evidence base about what works to reduce the risk of people who use violence. It is in keeping with that role that we raise our concerns about the government's current position that incarceration will improve the safety of victim survivors and significantly reduce the risk of ongoing violence. This evidence shows that improvements in safety come from investments outside or alongside the criminal justice system. Our research shows that there is no evidence that the reintroduction of mandatory sentencing legislation in the NT will have a positive impact on or improve the safety of women, children and the broader community. Indeed, research from across Australia demonstrates imprisonment does not reduce recidivism and that short terms of imprisonment in particular can result in increased criminal behaviour." End quote. No to Violence, Australia's largest peak body, Madam Speaker, dedicated to ending male family violence, had this to say, and I quote, "Evidence suggests short-term incarceration can increase the likelihood of individuals committing crimes in the future, especially when they lack access to adequate behaviour change programs or interventions while incarcerated. Incarceration can exacerbate risk factors for violence such as trauma, disconnection from support networks and financial stress. It is essential to recognise incarcerating someone does not necessarily stop their coercive and controlling behaviour." Ending quote there, Madam Speaker. NT Council of Social Services and NT COS and AMSENT, the Aboriginal Medical Services Alliance of the Northern Territory, had this to say in their submission, and I quote, "It is known that mandatory sentencing increases incarceration, is costly and is not effective as a crime deterrent. NT correction systems are not equipped for increasingly high numbers of DSFV offenders generally, DSFV offenders generally, and particularly for the increase of offenders on short sentences as a result of the amendment. NT corrections facilities do not have suitable programs for DFSV offenders, and as a result, mandatory sentencing will not reduce offending. There is evidence that periods of incarceration can increase the chances of reoffending." Ending quote. Madam Speaker, the Criminal Lawyers Association of the Northern Territory said, I quote, "We hold serious concerns the proposed mandatory sentencing provisions will, 1, disproportionately impact Aboriginal women, 2, undermine judicial discretion, 3, risk deterring victim survivors from reporting, 4, increase pressure on already overcrowded correctional facilities, 5, divert resources away from prevention, rehabilitation and victim support, and 6, potentially increase the risk of harm or death to victims." Ending quote. Madam Speaker, I could continue reading the submissions the Scrutiny Committee received when it comes to the contribution I'm making on this legislation, but it is fair to say from this small sample but very powerful sample that there is a strong and consistent advice and thoughts and expertise from all quarters when it comes to not supporting the mandatory sentencing provision on this piece of legislation. Madam Speaker, when it comes to mandatory sentencing for DV offences, it not only doesn't work, it actually can make things worse, and the experts have seen and heard this, Madam Speaker. Our Labor opposition supports many aspects of this bill. We support the measures that reflect best practice and enhance community safety, and we always will when it comes to representing Territorians. But, Madam Speaker, I say very clearly we cannot and we will not support the reintroduction of mandatory sentencing based on the expert advice. Madam Speaker, it is actually beyond belief that the CLP government is pushing ahead with this. We may be pleasantly surprised. They may put in an amendment through today in consideration of detail to remove this provision. We will absolutely support that amendment to remove it, Madam Speaker. It is frustrating that the CLP government simply refuses to listen to anyone, let alone the experts in the field, and they just forge ahead with their plans, thinking that they know better than the people who are dealing with DV day in and day out across the Territory. And despite all of the evidence of harm in our community and the anticipated harm that this amendment will cause to women and children across the Territory, they still remain silent, which indicates to me, Madam Speaker, that they will continue with this amendment in the legislation. Madam Speaker, the bill introduces mandatory sentencing with no minimum term, meaning someone who breaches a DV order, domestic violence order, could be jailed for just 7 days. 7 days, not long enough to access rehabilitation. 7 days, not long enough to change violent behaviour. 7 days, not long enough to keep victims safe in the long run. And, Madam Speaker, 7 days, certainly not long enough to sit in a cell in jail and grow more compassionate. In fact, the very opposite. It is long enough to sit in a cell to grow more angry and perhaps to return home more dangerous. And there is no mechanism for these sentences, Madam Speaker, to be served as alternatives to custody programs or residential behaviour change facilities. If the government could speak to that, Madam Speaker, that would be a real help. We know that when there is real change, it happens in programs when it is grounded in healing and rather than punishment-based. Absolutely, people need to face the consequences, Madam Speaker, but we see already inconsistencies from the CLP government on many different areas where they do not follow through with that belief that they have. Madam Speaker, we need laws built on evidence and data and, dare I say, led by experts. Madam Speaker, laws that empower victims and not just generate headlines for political purposes. We need general consultation, not just announcements of what is going to happen. And we need action, not posturing. Madam Speaker, this bill is not what the Territory needs in its current form. The bill has also spoken, Madam Speaker, the government has also spoken endlessly about root causes, yet it has failed to name a single one or address them or provide the provisions needed in what you would think this bill would help. Madam Speaker, victim survivors have been clear about what they need: safe, stable housing, financial independence, and access to community-based services and support. Not more punitive approaches, not short sentences that don't have an impact but cost the taxpayer a lot of money, and not just government spin. Madam Speaker, Clara Mills from the Catherine Women's Information and Legal Services, among other DV providers, has urged the CLP government to act on the real drivers of violence, to reduce housing waitlists, to address food insecurity and to invest in essential services and enabling infrastructure across the Territory. And she's right, Madam Speaker, that's something we have listened to. Madam Speaker, the CLP does not need to reinvent the wheel. The roadmap is already there. The Coroner's 35 recommendations, the 𝘼𝙂𝙼𝙄𝙇 roadmap, and the insights of all of those workers and experts on the front line providing their advice and guidance. And this is an important change, Madam Speaker, to ensure that victim survivors do have more protections. But when we see rush laws without a full process of scrutiny, that's where the mistakes are made by government. And we would like to see, from the Labor opposition's perspective, thoughtful reform that will actually create and promote community safety, Madam Speaker. And I welcome that the government is finally tabling, I believe this week, Madam Speaker, Coroner 𝘼𝑮𝑦𝑗𝑠 coroner report into the deaths of Miss Yunupingu, 𝘼𝙂𝙇𝙇, Kumaran Rabujana and 𝘽𝙄𝙇𝙇. Madam Speaker, the CLP have struggled to talk about the coronial findings, so this is a big step, but it is a step that the Labor opposition welcomes. Madam Speaker, the CLP say they're implementing most of the recommendations, and I would strongly encourage them to ensure that they are doing this work meaningfully. And we all know there is too much at stake in terms of rushing efforts, but there is also the mistake of not having any action to those words that they say on that side, Madam Speaker. And we all know that any lives lost in the Territory when it comes to domestic, family and sexual violence is a life too many lost. That the token efforts that we have already seen from the CLP will not make the long-term difference. So if they are honest and true about making a difference when it comes to domestic and family violence and stopping the crime that is associated with domestic violence for the sake of claiming political points, if it is meaningful, we will support it, Madam Speaker. We need to ensure that the CLP government is genuinely investing in these reforms because they will make that long-term difference we all need to see in our electorates and across the NT. There's no quick fix. There are no shortcuts, Madam Speaker, just hard effort that needs to be sustained when it comes to making a difference for the Territory. Madam Speaker, the CLP say that they will make a life safer for so many Territory women and children, including funding for therapeutic, culturally safe responses, more alternatives to custody, and victim-centred trauma-informed justice pathways. And we hope they continue that work. Again, that it's not just words, but there is action behind those words. Madam Speaker, the CLP say that they are the government of action, and I urge them to prove this when it comes to not repeating the mistakes of CLP governments of the past, and to ensure that the work they do goes beyond repeating the catchphrases and the slogans that they have said so many times in the last few months. The former Territory Labor government did a lot of work in this space, and we know not enough, Madam Speaker. But we cannot see Territorians continue to die at the hands of their partners here in the Territory and play a political football with that. We want to ensure that any government who is in power in the Territory can build strongly on the work done previously, to not reinvent the wheel, but most importantly, to listen to the experts in the field. Listen and act on their advice is what we urge the government to do, Madam Speaker. Not reinvent the wheel, to not stop engaging, listening and learning from organisations, because we know if we're going to make a difference, this is where it will truly happen. Madam Speaker, the Safe, Respected and Free from Violence Reduction Framework that was released by the former Labor government in 2018 is a solid guidepost for continuing much-needed reform across the Northern Territory. We, at the time, Madam Speaker, accompanied it with $70 million in the 24 budget, including an additional $30 million over 2 years, to implement the second action plan and to invest in health, justice and early intervention measures. The former Labor government funded men's behaviour change programs in Alice Springs, in 𝑨𝑮𝑻 and a pilot program in Katherine. Madam Speaker, the CLP is very proud that they have made an ongoing $36 million a year commitment to tackling domestic, family and sexual violence in the Territory. We welcome their commitment in this area. It's not enough, but we do welcome it, Madam Speaker. The real reforms will start when prevention measures are instigated, and that's where we would like to see the CLP government focusing more of their effort, Madam Speaker. Just last week, the latest crime statistics bear this out, Madam Speaker. In March 2025, there were 626 domestic violence-related assaults reported across the Territory, a jump of nearly 14% in just 12 months compared to March 2024, the same time last year. In the 7 months since the CLP came to office, the Northern Territory has seen 4,481 DV-related assaults, 428 more than in the previous 7 months, or an increase, Madam Speaker, of 11% when it comes to DV-related assaults. Darwin's DV assaults, Madam Speaker, are up nearly 23% since they took office. A double-digit increase have been recorded in Katherine, Tennant Creek and across our regional areas of the Northern Territory. And Madam Speaker, I don't want to actually make this debate about statistics. I do want to contribute that because it was released just on Friday, but to do anything different than to tell the true story here would be disingenuous by the government. But really the stories need to be about the real horror, the real trauma that is experienced by so many Territory women and children across the NT and all the communities that we represent. And statistics are a incredibly clinical way to look at this particular and very deep and troubling issue across the Northern Territory. But I have used the statistics today, Madam Speaker, because we have heard the Minister for Prevention of Domestic Violence quote statistics multiple times here in the Territory, and I hope that she takes some of those latest crime stats and works with her department on reduction of harm in DV, Madam Speaker. We know that the Minister has made some big promises about turning them around, and we really look forward to supporting some of these initiatives, particularly if they fall in any of our electorates, but any of our electorates across the NT, if they had to benefit from changes, from real changes that are led by experts, that are led by those in the field when it comes to keeping Territory women and children safe. And yes, Madam Speaker, I acknowledge men can be victims of domestic, family and sexual violence as well. And alarmingly, again, those stats show that it's women and children who face the large brunt of DV in our community. Madam Speaker, I hope that Minister Kale is looking at the latest figures and realising that there are some key areas that require complete focus if we are to end violence against Territory women and children. Some of these areas we encourage the Minister to focus on, Madam Speaker: strong and enduring partnerships, well-resourced prevention measures, evidence-based approaches, and targeted and sustained investment in DV prevention. Madam Speaker, 6 months ago, I stood outside of this parliament with fellow members of the crossbench and my opposition colleagues, offering bipartisan support to lobby the government to go to Canberra and finally get us needs-based funding. But since then, it has been silence. And today is an opportune time, Madam Speaker, to renew that call, to say, let's all work together in this place when it's about securing that much-needed needs-based funding for the Territory so that all of the people we represent can benefit from a reduction of domestic, family and sexual violence in the Northern Territory, from ensuring that there is some type of work around preventing the crime responses in the Territory, and, to improve the crime responses and prevent crime in the Territory, and to ensure there is long-term solutions and that they are community-led. And let's make sure that our remote communities are not left behind, that they're not forgotten when it comes to investment as well, Madam Speaker. Let's make sure that we can all work together so that every man, woman and child, their families and their support in the Territory are able to live in safety and to live with dignity. And Madam Speaker, to all of those in the Territory who work in our legal services, who work in the organisations that pick up people, who mop up the blood, who wipe away the tears, and who help people who are at their most vulnerable and traumatised, particularly the women's safe houses in the Northern Territory, those frontline workers across the Territory that see fellow Territorians at their most lowest or at their worst. We say thank you for the amazing work that you do, because you don't just do it once, you don't just do it in work hours, you do it all the time, outside of hours, and sometimes even in your own private residence. Madam Speaker, we thank all of those who work to keep the Territory safe. We hope the CLP government will actually listen to all of them and provide and support measures that will make a difference, not just for this political term over the next 3.5 years that is left, but for an endearing legacy of working together with the option of leaning on the opposition and the crossbench in a bipartisan way so that we will see the difference we need today, tomorrow. Madam Speaker, we will keep fighting for the domestic, family and sexual violence sector, and we will keep encouraging the government to listen to them as the experts to provide those measures of safety that will create and promote a community across the territory that can once and for all stamp out family, domestic and sexual violence. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member for Goyder.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to proudly support the domestic and family violence reforms introduced by this government. Reforms that mark a long overdue turning point in how we protect victims and hold repeat offenders to account. I want to begin by acknowledging my good friend, the Attorney-General, for her leadership in bringing this legislation forward, and the Minister for Domestic Violence, who is also leading the way in this space. Now, Madam Speaker, we just heard from the Leader of the Opposition that in the last 7 months, by cherry-picking some statistics out, which I really do enjoy to see, that the CLP hasn't done enough in this space. That is why we are here today with passing legislation to make change, Madam Speaker. We acknowledge that there is more work to be done, and that is why we are voting on and passing a bill today. That's our job, Madam Speaker. Now, Madam Speaker, tackling domestic and family violence is never easy. It involves confronting some of the most traumatic, complex and emotionally charged issues we face as legislators. But through these reforms, the Minister has shown that the government is willing to do what is necessary to protect the most vulnerable members of our community. These are not easy issues to tackle, and this government is showing the courage to act where others have stalled and in fact have gone backwards under the previous Labor government. Madam Speaker, domestic and family violence has plagued our communities for far too long. For far too long, the system has let victims down. It has spoken in soft words, with soft hands, while women, and mostly women, Madam Speaker, but I do acknowledge children and men, have suffered, endured, and in far too many cases, lost their lives. Shame. We all know the statistics, but behind every number is a name, a family, a life torn apart. According to the Northern Territory Police, we've seen a 117% increase in domestic and family violence-related calls over the past decade. This is not just a number, it is a staggering measure of pain, fear, and trauma playing out in homes across the Territory. Under the previous Labor government, mandatory sentencing for domestic violence offenders was scrapped. And what followed was nearly a decade of worsening abuse and rising fear. We saw the consequences of the soft-on-crime approach. More violence, more breaches, and more women murdered by partners who should have been stopped. Enough is enough. This government is drawing a line in the sand. Under these new laws, we are restoring mandatory sentencing for repeat and serious breaches of domestic violence orders. This isn't about being punitive for the sake of it. This is about community safety. That's not just tough talk, Madam Speaker. This is common sense. Because if the perpetrator is behind bars, the victim is safe. This is about telling perpetrators that the days of ignoring court orders and walking free are over. If you breach a DVO and cause harm or threaten harm, you will go to prison, and the Minister for Corrections will find you a bed. If you have previously breached a DVO and do it again, you'll go to prison. And if you repeatedly breach an order within a short period, you'll go to prison. This approach is backed by research. We know that a small proportion of repeat offenders are responsible for a large share of violent crimes. This is what criminologists refer to as the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule. Roughly 20% of offenders are responsible for about 80% of the harm. And that's exactly what these laws are designed to deal with. Chronic offenders. High-risk individuals, the ones who don't just make a mistake but return to cause harm again and again. Mandatory sentencing targets them. It protects the community, reduces the risk of escalation and sends a clear message. If you break these laws, if you breach your DVO, there will be consequences. Now, Madam Speaker, let me address something else. We've seen a small but vocal number of critics emerge, some legal organisations, some commenters, who are more concerned about the rights of perpetrators than the safety of the victims. To them, I say this: your priorities are backwards. Let me be clear. If your first instinct is to protect the abuser rather than the abused, you need to reassess your priorities. This government is standing on the side of victims and we don't apologise for that, Madam Speaker. It is not justice to let a violent partner breach an order and walk away with a slap on the wrist. It's not compassion to protect someone who has repeatedly ignored the court's authority and placed the victim in fear. And it's certainly not reform to maintain a system where women are being abused and murdered by men who are already on the police radar. These reforms are victim-centred. They are designed to protect lives, not ideologies. And I'm proud to support a government that understands that. Madam Speaker, and these reforms don't just stop with the sentencing. The Victims Register is also being expanded to better support those at risk. We are expanding that register, which means that survivors will be notified if the offender breaches parole or electronic monitoring. Previously, the register could only notify victims if the offender was sentenced to imprisonment, and that's not good enough. Under our changes, victims will now be alerted to breaches of electronic monitoring, conditions of parole, suspended sentences, and more. This is about empowering victims with information, about letting them take the necessary precautions and protect themselves when a threat is emerging. This is common sense, Madam Speaker. This is real-time protection, and it's a clear message to victims that you are no longer being left in the dark. It's a simple principle, one that has been neglected for far too long, that victims deserve to know. We're also increasing the Victims of Crime levy so that those found guilty of offences still contribute to the support services victims so desperately need. It's a fairer system and one that puts the burden where it belongs, on the perpetrator, not the victim. Let us not forget, Madam Speaker, how these laws also stack up nationally. The Northern Territory is now clearly one of the strongest jurisdictions in Australia when it comes to mandatory domestic violence sentencing. Only New South Wales has something comparable, and even their regime is more limited, requiring that an act of violence accompany the breach. Ours captures a broader set of dangerous behaviours and gives the courts the tools to deal with them appropriately. Madam Speaker, this is what real leadership looks like. We're not waiting for another tragedy. We're not turning our blind eye or offering words without action. We're getting on with the job of protecting Territorians. We are standing up for those who have been unheard and unprotected for far too long. I again commend the Minister for bringing forward these strong reforms. The Northern Territory is now leading the nation in how we respond to domestic and family violence. And let us not forget the lives lost and the lives still at risk to domestic and family and sexual violence. This legislation is not just legal reform, it is a moral obligation. To my colleagues in this chamber, we all know of someone directly or through friends who has been affected by domestic violence. It could be a friend, a neighbour, a family member, and these reforms are not abstract. They are real. They will save lives, and they will give victims hope, and they will give offenders a reason to think twice. I urge all members of this House to support these reforms with the seriousness and respect they deserve. I commend this bill to the House.
Member for 𝑨𝑮𝑻.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I support the bill titled Domestic and Family Violence and Victims Legislation Amendment Bill 2025, Serial 22, brought to the House by the Attorney-General, as these amendments in the bill ensure that in certain circumstances the court must sentence an offender guilty of a breach of a DVO to a term of actual imprisonment. For far too long, victims have been left behind by the previous Labor government when they removed the mandatory sentencing for domestic violence offences, and this bill amendment restores our commitment to those victims. The purpose of the bill to amend the Domestic and Family Violence Act 2007 and the Domestic and Family Violence Regulations 2008, the Victims of Crime Rights and Services Act 2006, the Victims of Crimes Rights and Services Regulations 2010, and the Victims of Crimes Assistance Act 2006. Madam Speaker, under the new mandatory sentencing regime, the court must now sentence an offender to an actual term of imprisonment where an offender breaches an existing DVO and harm was involved, or a threat of harm was involved against the victim. Also, an actual term of imprisonment for an offender breaches their DVO and has a prior breach for a DVO, or a situation where the offender has repeatedly breached their DVO in a short amount of time, 28 days. Madam Speaker, I need to extend that hearing test that my member for Karama always offers the opposition Labor government, because I repeat, these are existing DBO harms, offenders who breach prior breaches and also repeatedly breaches of their DBO. Madam Speaker, under Labor's watch, the Territory experienced extremely high domestic violence assaults over the past 8 years, with a number of women murdered by their partners. Many victims live day in and day out with domestic violence, and in the past, too many of these victims have paid that high price with their life. This is a tragedy for the deceased and their family members. Madam Speaker, by specifying a reduced time frame, we'll see perpetrators removed from the family unit earlier so no further harm can be done to those who are the victims. Madam Speaker, the bill amendments to the Victims of Crime Assistance Act 2006 amends Section 8 of the Act to allow for modernised electronic application process aimed to speed up these applications. Madam Speaker, the bill also increases the victim levy and provide more funds to the victims for the use of victim services, and I know the opposition and crossbench are always advocating for more funds in this space. Madam Speaker, these changes show our government's commitment to putting the rights of the victims and their families first. Only last week, the budget was handed down, and a record by the Minister for Prevention of Domestic Violence of ongoing funding of $36 million a year to address domestic, family and sexual violence for new, expanded and ongoing programs to prevent domestic violence. Some of these programs, Madam Speaker, are the Circuit Breaker program, Co-Responder Early Intervention with NT Police, offender programs in prison, domestic, family and sexual violence resource centres, remote safe houses, programs in prison for people committing domestic, family, sexual and violence, and specialist domestic violence courts, programs in community settings for people committing domestic, family and sexual violence. Madam Speaker, for too long, these victims have had no voice, and it's time for our government to listen to them and act for them on their behalf. Madam Speaker, these changes show our government's commitment and putting those rights first. Madam Speaker, in 8 years under the Labor government, domestic and family violence increased by 81% across the Territory, and we need to make sure these programs are effective to reduce and prevent that domestic violence. Madam Speaker, this government is committed to reducing crime and place the rights and the needs of the victims first, including those who are victims of that domestic violence. I thank the whole of government working together and putting these victims first, and the Attorney-General for bringing these amendments, and commend the bill to the House.
Are there any more speakers? Member for 𝘼𝙂𝙇.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I do rise today to speak in relation to the bill that's being presented to the Assembly. We do know that this is a heartbreaking and pressing issue that affects many in our communities: domestic, family and sexual violence. Madam Speaker, each time we speak of statistics, we must never lose sight of their true meaning. Every number represents someone who was deeply loved, someone who mattered, someone who brought value to the lives of others. Each statistic is a life taken from us too soon. Madam Speaker, we cannot ignore the devastating reality that over 8 women in the Northern Territory have allegedly been murdered as a direct result of domestic violence. These lives were stolen, and those families now carry the weight of the unimaginable loss. I stand in wavering support for the provisions that strengthen notification requirements, ensuring victims are informed when perpetrators are released from prison. This is a critical step in prioritising the safety and peace of mind. I strongly endorse the increase in the victims' levy, a measure that not only reinforces accountability, but also provides vital resources to support those who are most affected by domestic violence. We owe it to the women in the Northern Territory and to every individual affected by this epidemic to act decisively, to be bold and to deliver meaningful change, Madam Speaker. This is not just a legislative amendment. This is, of course, a call for action for justice and safety in our communities. DV is an insidious disease. It is treatable and it is preventable. And it continues to plague our communities. Over the last 3 weeks alone, Madam Speaker, I've personally intervened by contacting the police and emergency services to respond to safety concerns in my community, relating to community members calling out desperately for help. This is a grim reality that we must commit collectively and resolutely to change. A world where domestic violence is eradicated must be more than a vision, Madam Speaker. It must be a shared mission. A world where women and children live free from domestic violence, where jealousy and aggression are never tolerated, and where respect and equity prevail. This is a future I'm passionate about and dedicated to building alongside the strong, resilient members of our domestic and family violence sector and our community. Together, we can make this vision a reality. To achieve this, we must continue supporting the domestic violence sector. We must empower those at the forefront to lead, to innovate and deliver meaningful programs and solutions. Madam Speaker, violence is not inherited. It is learned. This understanding must guide our approach. Addressing domestic violence at its root causes, bold investment in primary prevention. This means dismantling systemic barriers, tackling discrimination, promoting gender equality, and fostering an environment where violence is neither normalised nor excused. The recent coronial inquest into the tragic deaths of 4 Aboriginal women yielded 35 vital recommendations outlined in the coroner's report. These recommendations provided a clear and actionable pathway to preventing domestic and family and sexual violence across the Northern Territory. Implementing these recommendations must be an urgent priority, and a response must be led by local voices, specialist services, and most critically, Aboriginal communities and victim survivors. We must not repeat the same deep harms caused by the Northern Territory intervention. Instead, we must focus on providing the necessary support, resources and funding to bolster specialist workforce capable of driving these changes. Madam Speaker, the Legislative Scrutiny Committee's examination of the Domestic and Family Violence and Victims Legislation Amendment Bill 2025 revealed valuable insights, with 21 well-researched submissions from stakeholders, experts and victim survivors. Those contributions were invaluable. However, it is deeply disappointing that the committee did not hold a public hearing. By denying a platform for public testimony, the voices of victims, frontline workers and community members were sidelined. This omission falls short of the best practice consultation, undermining this very bill and the trust of our community. Public hearings, Madam Speaker, are not a procedural luxury. They are essential to robust legislative processes. They provide a space for lived experiences, actionable recommendations and crucial expertise to strengthen and inform our laws. I must also address a grave concern within this bill, Madam Speaker, the reintroduction of mandatory sentencing. While the opposition supports many provisions of this bill, we cannot support the mandatory sentencing provision. Madam Speaker, evidence consistently shows that mandatory sentencing fails to deter domestic and family violence. Worse, brief sentences, sometimes as short as 7 days, deprive offenders of the opportunity to engage in meaningful programs, behavioural change programs, alcohol and other drug programs, positive living programs, without alternative to custody facilities or interventions targeting the root causes of the criminogenic behaviour, mandatory sentencing will not make our communities safer. In fact, Madam Speaker, shorter sentences can heighten the risk to women and children immediately following an offender's release. Without sufficient post-release support and monitoring, this heightened risk goes unchecked. Investment in post-release services is not optional. It is necessary for victim safety and long-term community security. The opposition, Madam Speaker, remains steadfast in our commitment to evidence-based solutions. Fully implementing the coronial inquest recommendations is essential to achieving meaningful progress. I urge the government to seriously consider the well-informed submissions received and to translate these insights into action. Madam Speaker, I want to also address the government's allocation of funds for tackling domestic, family and sexual violence. While the promised $180 million over 4 years, then became $36 million annually, is a step absolutely in the right direction, its allocation raises serious concerns. The domestic violence sector, already under strain, has voiced doubts about whether its funding will deliver the positive outcomes we all desire. Many decisions regarding this funding have been made unilaterally, bypassing the voices of frontline workers and, critically, the victims themselves. A significant portion of this funding has been allocated to agencies like corrections, and while we support offender rehabilitation initiatives, funding these programs at the expense of services supporting women and children is unacceptable. Frontline services are already struggling to meet the growing demand, and further diverting funds undermines their capacity to provide effective and life-saving support. The government claims to prioritise prevention and early intervention, yet programs they tout as successes, in reality, Madam Speaker, are rebranded initiatives from many previous different administrations. Take its circuit breaker program, for example. While it provides valuable support for at-risk youth, allocating $6.6 million from the domestic violence funding to this initiative is a misstep. Such decisions shortchange women and children in crisis, robbing them of well-funded services they need and deserve. Moreover, the abolition of the Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence Advisory Forum has left a glaring gap in consultation mechanisms. This absence undermines transparency and reduces the effectiveness of decision-making. Had the forum been involved, the allocation of funds might have been more thoughtful and impactful. The $36 million allocated this year is a welcomed contribution. But to maximise its impact, we must meaningfully engage with frontline experts, victim survivors and the broader community, Madam Speaker. Only through collaboration can we ensure that every dollar spent addresses the immediate needs and achieves the long-term change. Madam Speaker, I absolutely want to acknowledge and commend the dedication of organisations, experts and individuals who have contributed to this legislative inquiry. Their submissions are a testament to the community's unwavering commitment to eradicating domestic, family and sexual violence. Moving forward, the government must prioritise genuine consultation, evidence-based reforms and accountability to create a territory where violence is not tolerated. Madam Speaker, it is important, and we have heard this morning, again, the conversation about statistics. Madam Speaker, let us remember that as more women gain confidence in the system, we will see an increase in reported statistics. This rise reflects their growing trust in the system, their willingness to disclose their experiences, and their courage to seek help. As members of Parliament, we must consider carefully this context when referring to statistics. In some cases, such increases can be measured as a sign of growing progress in this sector. Evidence that awareness is growing and that in part the system is continuing to grow and support them. Madam Speaker, it is important to acknowledge across the Northern Territory those organisations who continue every day to do an amazing job. Madam Speaker, those are organisations like the Women's Safety Services of Central Australia. They are the work of the 𝘽𝙂𝙼𝙄𝙇𝙇 Women's Family Violence Group, Dawn House, Doors, Top End Women's Legal Service, Catherine's Women's Legal Service, the Central Australian Women's Legal Services, Legal Aid, 𝘼𝙂𝙇𝙇, all of these amazing organisations, Madam Speaker, who work every day at the front line, doing the hard work. The Domestic Violence Legal Service, Madam Speaker. Importantly, I want to also take the moment today to acknowledge the work in our remote communities. There are a number of safe houses spread across the Northern Territory, Madam Speaker, who do an incredible job. They are often places that absolutely provide critical services that are a safe place for women and children in our community to absolutely come to get help, to get support, Madam Speaker. And I want to particularly acknowledge all of those safe houses. The 𝘼𝙂𝙼𝙇 Safe House, the Tea Tree Safe House, the 𝘼𝙂𝙼𝙼𝙇 Safe House, Elliot. I know that there are 𝘽𝙂𝙼𝙼𝙄𝙇𝙇. I want to also acknowledge in the electorate of 𝘽𝙄𝙇, Hermannsburg, Ladjamanu, the Kalgoorlie safe houses, all who do an amazing job, Madam Speaker, providing a wonderful, wonderful service to our community, because it is absolutely important. Madam Speaker, I also want to acknowledge that domestic, family and sexual violence law reform will always be needed in the Northern Territory. As best practice standards change, the law will constantly need to be contemporised to reflect those practices, Madam Speaker, and that is something that we should all be incredibly mindful of to work on each and every day. Madam Speaker, I want to acknowledge that the previous government did undertake a significant piece of reform in this space, in the Domestic Family Violence Bill of 2023, reform which I was very proud to deliver on, and that absolutely addressed a number of measures as well. For the first time in the Northern Territory's history, it did ensure that coercive control was featured in Northern Territory legislation, and that provisions were in place to begin the work to address misidentification, particularly of Aboriginal women in domestic and family violence situations. That work was incredibly important and needs to continue to be undertaken. I want to acknowledge work that is being undertaken and has been carried forward by this new government around ensuring that we deliver training to our frontline workers around responding to domestic, family and sexual violence, because it is incredibly important to understand and to do that work. And Madam Speaker, as I said not too long ago in this speech, over the last 3 weeks I have reported matters to police. I've sat with victims of domestic and family violence on the side of the street while we waited for the authorities to get there. And we've spoken, I've taken the time to talk with young people in these situations while we've waited for an ambulance or while we've waited for the police, Madam Speaker. And what we understand is that there is a significant volume of work to be done in this space across all levels. And one is, again, about informing and working with people in our community to understand just what domestic and family violence is. It doesn't necessarily always have to be in the form of physical violence, Madam Speaker. There is so much in this space that needs to be continually discussed, and we need to work with people to understand that. Madam Speaker, this is also about continuing to increase the investment in the Northern Territory to respond to this situation. Again, we've spoken about the need to call on the Commonwealth Government for needs-based funding in the Northern Territory, because it is absolutely critical that we invest in this space to reform this space, to drive the changes that are needed in our community, Madam Speaker. Another initiative I've also spoken about many times in this parliament is the need to look at public housing complexes and the need to look at whether we can transition some of those over to women's safety services so that we have transitional accommodation and housing for women when they leave women's crisis services and shelters, Madam Speaker, because it is important that we have those provisions in place to support women and children. The men's behavioural change programs rolled out across the Northern Territory are absolutely amazing, Madam Speaker, and I want to acknowledge the organisations who deliver those services. It's incredible. I've seen firsthand many participants who have done the programs and then who advocate for people to continue to do the programs and engage in those programs moving forward, Madam Speaker. I think that is a positive step in the right direction. I also think that it is important for men to stand up and call out domestic, family and sexual violence in our communities, because it is important. Every man has a role to play in this space, because we need to be setting the example. We need to be showing people in our community that violence in any form is not okay, and that we need to make sure that we change this horrific rate of which domestic and family violence is being seen in the Northern Territory, Madam Speaker. And we also need to be mindful of language. Language absolutely matters, and people can sometimes get carried away on the sporting field, and they can start by not even recognising that they are actually being derogatory towards women. And this is stuff that we absolutely need to be mindful of in our communities. This is the work that we need to continue to do, Madam Speaker, because this is how we drive change. We can drive change in all areas. Domestic and family violence is everyone's business. It is not a black issue, it is a territory issue. And we must work together to overcome those rates of domestic, family and sexual violence, because they are absolutely horrific. And as a jurisdiction, we want to be known for what the Territory is best for, and that is our amazing community, our lifestyle and our wonderful people, not the horrific rates of domestic, family and sexual violence that we are continuing to see, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, this has been an issue for some time, and it's going to continue to be a space that we're all going to need to work in together to drive that change. And the best change that we are going to see is when we empower our local communities to look at local solutions, law and justice groups, supporting the DV and specialist services in our communities, Madam Speaker, and absolutely doing that important work is fundamental to the success of the Northern Territory. So this is an important piece of legislation. I have seen many times where this work and these changes will absolutely be welcomed. Madam Speaker, I remember as a small kid being out in community, visiting my family, and family talking about sometimes someone from prison who was being released was being put on a bus going back to the community where the same person was who they had caused harm to. So I absolutely am supportive of the changes in this bill today around the notification provisions and certainly around the increase to the victims levy. Mandatory sentencing, that repeal only came into effect in 2023, Madam Speaker, so it hasn't been in for a significant period of time like some people in this chamber have alluded to today. And what we have seen, Madam Speaker, and what we have heard from in expert testimony in those submissions and when we were speaking with the Department of Attorney General and Justice is that People are out there talking about the maximum term of imprisonment as if that's what every offender or person before the court who is sentenced is going to get. What they have failed to speak about, Madam Speaker, is that there is no minimum requirement for a term of imprisonment. So someone very well may be sent to prison for 7 days or for 14 days, and in the current climate means that they will not be able to participate in any program at all to address their behaviour, because no program only runs for 7 to 14 days. That is the problem when you talk about mandatory sentencing and you have those minimum periods. Someone who goes to prison for 7 days or 14 days, that does not give women and children extensive respite from these situations. It perpetuates their anxiety and their fear because the perpetrator is incarcerated, there is no program, they are getting angrier, they are frustrated that they are in there, they are being told things. No one is addressing the complex needs, no one is providing the intensive supports and interventions that are required to respond and change the behaviours. That is what is lacking here right now. The changes that are being brought in today by the CLP government also do not provide an option for the court to look at mandatory sentencing to an alternative to custody facility in the Northern Territory. Evidence shows us, evidence tells us, quantitative and qualitative data sets tell us that alternative to custody programs in the Northern Territory are successful, are working, are changing lives. You look at those programs in Alice Springs, the Women's Life Skills Camp, and the programs on Groote Island for the alternative to custody, working, a good success rate, a reduction in recidivism, Madam Speaker. These are programs that work. These are programs that we need more of in the Northern Territory. These are initiatives that we should be allowing the court to consider at the time that these changes are coming in. Maximum and minimum terms of imprisonment will not change anything if there are no programs in place to address the complex needs and challenges that people face. We've heard that in those submissions where people are saying it is actually worse for women and children if someone is sitting in prison for only 7 days or 14 days with no program. It is better if someone can be sent to a residential rehabilitation program, sentenced to a men's behavioural change program if it's a man, sentenced to life skills, sentenced to drug and alcohol. They're the things that matter. Now, I absolutely acknowledge that people are going to get up today and they're going to talk about alcohol. But people who blame alcohol as the sole reason for domestic and family violence are cowards. Alcohol absolutely exacerbates the severity of domestic and family violence, but it does not cause it. People's behaviours and attitudes towards their loved ones already exists. It's a pre-existing condition. Alcohol, absolutely admit this, alcohol intensifies the severity, but we need to address the actual behaviours. So when we hear people before court or who have been interviewed about why they did DV and they say, because I was drunk, that's a coward. Because they're blaming a substance for their own behaviour. What we need to do is to change that behaviour. Change the way in which they think about or think it's okay. There's a really important piece of work that needs to be undertaken across the Northern Territory as well, and it's one that not many people are talking about, and that is jealousing, and that is trying to address the behaviour in which people see that jealousing is a way to justify violence. It's not. We do need to invest more resources into working particularly with our younger cohorts right across the Northern Territory. around this thing called jealousing and what it actually means and how it causes great harm in our communities, but also as well around getting into our schools and delivering programs and dismantling stereotypes. There's a great program that runs across the Northern Territory. It's called Boys Can, Girls Can, and it's also known as Mums Can, Dads Can. And it helps as well around normalising and dismantling that it doesn't matter what your gender is, you can absolutely do anything and take on those important roles in your community, Madam Speaker. And that's work that we absolutely need to continue to support in those reforms, Madam Speaker. I want to acknowledge that we did significant work when we were in government as rolling out the specialist domestic violence courts, an initiative we are very proud of, an initiative we hear the CLP are going to continue and roll out in other locations across the Northern Territory. And for members of the Parliament who haven't had the opportunity to go down to the courts in Alice Springs, if you ever get the opportunity to go down, talk to them about the Specialist DV Court. It's a really wonderful initiative that absolutely worked with the sector in addressing the concerns around people giving testimony or giving evidence or victim statements in the courtroom and often not wanting to be or absolutely suffering from severe stress and anxiety and being really scared to be in the room with the perpetrator at the time of giving that evidence. So some careful consideration, some careful design really led to a really wonderful program being developed in the Northern Territory, it's Alice Springs Local Court, which again is heartening to hear that that will be rolled out across the Northern Territory, Madam Speaker, because it is quite important. So this is an important issue. We all must continue to work in this space. Certainly, there are many of these changes that are welcomed. Certainly, when it comes to that DB provision, it's important to acknowledge that, yes, the government are bringing in a round of measures, but certainly we want to listen to the expert advice, the lived experiences in our communities, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I will, understanding Order 43, get an extension of time if that's possible.
Is an extension granted? An extension is granted. Please continue.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Again, the most important people in this entire conversation across the Northern Territory absolutely are our victims. We need to make sure that we have a victim-centred approach to responding to domestic, family and sexual violence across the Northern Territory, and that the voices are embedded and are empowered in all of our conversations and in any of our contemporisation of Northern Territory legislation. Incredibly important that we do that, Madam Speaker. Again, I just wanted to, in conclusion, just really again say that when it comes to this space, the real heroes in this space are our amazing organisations across the Northern Territory who are on the front line, who have to deal with these conflict situations every day. They have to deal with the trauma that many people in our community are faced with. They have to be strong, resilient, and I just want to acknowledge them in this contribution today and say thank you for the work you do. You are seen, you are heard, you are absolutely valued, and we absolutely need to continue to do the work to help you, to help the community. Madam Speaker, I just think it is again important that as men we all stand up, and I am standing here today as a proud Aboriginal man, and I will absolutely say it again, and I've said it time and time again, there may be aspects of our culture that non-Indigenous people see as brutal and as harmful. When we go through ceremonial business, when there is sorry business, when we lose a loved one. But domestic, family and sexual violence has no place in the Aboriginal cultural community. It is not our way, it is not our culture, and this demonisation of all men, regardless if they are Aboriginal or not, is an important process we need to actually work through. And the more men that stand up and call out domestic, family and sexual violence, the more chance we have to respond to this, the more we can work together in our communities to help. Because, Madam Speaker, as I said in this contribution today, there are 9 women in the Northern Territory who have lost their lives already this year to domestic, family and sexual violence. There are 3 other women in the Northern Territory who have been tragically killed in the Northern Territory through a motor vehicle running down, and that is directly also connected to domestic, family and sexual violence allegedly going through the process. That is 12 women in the Northern Territory who have been killed. 12 women in the Northern Territory who meant so much to us. And they are now silenced. They are now not here. So everything that we do must absolutely be to change what is happening in the Northern Territory. Because, Madam Speaker, I am absolutely devastated at the rate in which domestic, family and sexual violence nationally is somehow being normalised. It is not okay. Australia has a problem right across the country when it comes to DV, and we all need to work together to respond to it. And I do thank the Attorney-General for many of those provisions in the bill because, again, the notification period and the victims levy, really important. I want to acknowledge the work done by previous government around featuring coercive control in legislation and contemporising the language and DVOs and the provisions and enforced corrections orders. They are all important, but we absolutely need to continue this work. Thank you to all the services who do the work. This is something that we're going to continue to talk about. This is something that we need to continue to talk about. And this is something that we need to continue to get behind and fund. I am absolutely heartened to see a new Federal Labor Minister in Tanya Plibersek and the Assistant Minister Jed Carney. Absolutely have spoken to them already about getting them to the Northern Territory to meet our hard-working frontline services to actually hear about the experiences that many of them have to deal with each and every day. Because, Madam Speaker, it is incredibly important that we continue as a parliament to lobby the Commonwealth for that investment. So, Madam Speaker, I will be supporting parts of the bill. I won't be supporting the mandatory sentencing provisions in line with those submissions that have been put forward by the committee. I think that there are absolutely other ways to do that. I think we had the work of the 𝘼𝙂𝙼 in the Northern Territory, which absolutely created a pathway forward for us. We know what needs to be done. The work has been done. We need the investment now from the Territory and the Commonwealth Government to continue to do that, because that's how we drive the change. We don't need to go back out and do the work. We need to listen to the sector, listen to the victims, and invest in the areas that they have identified. And again, when it comes to stats, we've heard from the sector that as people are comfortable disclosing and coming forward, there will be a spike in the stats. Because women feel comfortable that the system is working and the system will protect them. Women will absolutely feel comfortable to seek help and know that there is an appropriate response. And that's something that we all need to be mindful of. Every time we talk about statistics when it comes to domestic, family and sexual violence, we are talking about one of ours. We are talking about a Territorian. We need to do it respectfully in this space, Madam Speaker, and that goes for all of us. So, Madam Speaker, I look forward to the other contributions being made today. To the members of this parliament who haven't yet had the opportunity to meet with our wonderful, hard-working DV sector, reach out to them, talk with them, understand their challenges, listen to their solutions. If you have not had the opportunity to meet with Catholic Care or the 𝘽𝙂𝙇𝙇 women's family violence groups or the programs done by women's safety services across the Northern Territory and our legal services to hear the programs that they actually acknowledge as having a huge impact in the Territory, please reach out to them. They will tell you how they are working. They will tell you how they are absolutely changing lives. We expanded the capacity for those, but that's certainly something that we need to continue to look at, how that capacity is growing, how we need to invest in it. Incredibly important. I absolutely want to acknowledge the contributions in here today. I think they've all been respectful. I think this is a demonstration that this is important to every person in this chamber, and certainly this is going to be ongoing work in this space as we look to address domestic, family and sexual violence in our community. But I think we all have a role and a responsibility here to call out the level of violence when we see it. Don't drive past it. Don't walk past it, because the standard you drive past or the standard you walk past is the standard that you accept. If people are in help, stop and help them, or make sure that you are in a position to call the authorities to help them and that you are safe as well. But we need to continue to do it. We cannot normalise this terrible behaviour. We absolutely need to respond to it. It is insidious. We do need to continue to work in this space. But, Madam Speaker, I am thankful for the opportunity to contribute to this debate this morning. It is very important, and I look forward to those other contributions.
Are there any other speakers? In closing, Minister? No? Member for Johnston.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. One moment. Madam Speaker, I rise today to speak, as with my fellow members, on the proposed amendments to the Domestic and Family Violence Act. I want to begin by acknowledging the intent behind this legislation to increase safety for victim survivors and to strengthen accountability for those who use violence. These are objectives that I support without hesitation, and I know they're objectives that everyone in this chamber stands behind. But I cannot support Section 5, Division 1, Part 2 of this bill, the introduction of mandatory sentencing for contraventions of domestic violence orders. I believe this provision should not pass. This clause, this mandatory sentencing provision, will not make victim survivors safer. In fact, the overwhelming evidence tells us that it risks doing exactly the opposite. Let me be absolutely clear. I am not opposing this measure because I underestimate the scale or urgency of the domestic and family violence crisis. On the contrary, this issue fills me with despair. Domestic violence is the most devastating crime crisis we face. It claims lives, overwhelms our prisons, stretches police and domestic, family and sexual violence services to the brink, and shatters families and communities. I support strong, immediate action, but that action must be effective. It must be based on evidence, and above all, it must not cause further harm. And what fills me with despair is not just the violence itself, but the knowledge that we could be doing more to protect victims, and we are not. We are choosing politics over solutions. We're ignoring what works. This is not leadership. We have a responsibility not to be populist, not to chase headlines, but to act wisely, to consult deeply, and to legislate with integrity. Saying we don't need evidence or that we don't need to listen to victims or experts or victim survivors is simply not good enough. It was not good enough for Miss 𝘽𝙂𝙼𝙼, for 𝘽𝙂𝙼𝙼𝙼, for Kuman Rabancha and Kumanjai Haywood. It was not good enough for the 12 women that we know of who have been allegedly killed by DV since this Parliament began sitting in October last year. It will never be good enough for those still at risk. This Parliament must be mature enough to work together, guided by the best information available, to make laws that actually work. This is what our communities expect, and this is what our communities deserve. In preparation for this morning, I spoke again to domestic violence legal services and frontline services. They all reiterated, mandatory sentencing will not make us safer. This bill cannot pass in its current form. These are the people who are working every single day with the people this bill is designed to protect and keep safe, and they are telling us it will not work, it will make things worse. It will come as no surprise to the members of this chamber that I have significant concerns about mandatory sentencing. In October last year in this chamber, I talked about mandatory sentencing and the research I had done at that point to see whether and how it was effective. At that time, I was not able to find one piece of evidence in the hundreds of papers of research that have been published, any suggestion that mandatory sentencing has provided a deterrent for offenders or make communities safer. I refer again, as I did then, to the report of the Northern Territory Law Commission, Northern Territory Law Reform Commission in May 2021, which stated unequivocally that mandatory sentencing does not work. In the words of Justice Mildren, the premise of those who argue in favour of mandatory sentencing is that it acts as a deterrent. There is no evidence whatsoever to support this premise. The whole underlying paradigm of sentencing law is that a sentence involves the exercise of discretion by a judicial officer, someone who is trained for and paid to do this job. Judges are the experts, not politicians. And as this government continues to expand mandatory sentencing laws, I've continued to look and ask for evidence supporting this approach, that it will make us safer and that it will address the crime crisis. And I have still not been able to find one piece of evidence that supports this. And when asked, the Attorney-General's Department could not produce a single piece of evidence that mandatory sentencing works. Instead, they offered a vague hope that short-term prison terms might act as a circuit breaker. But we know that prison is not a circuit breaker, it's a pressure cooker. And this is not evidence, this is politicisation of people's lives, and it poses great risks to victims in our community who are already vulnerable to incredibly harmful situations. All 21 expert submissions to the Legislative Scrutiny Committee, of which I am a member, warned us that this bill will not reduce domestic violence, it will increase harm. And a quick comment on the Scrutiny Committee. Once again, the government members of this committee refused to hold public hearings on this bill, despite many submissions requesting the opportunity to speak to the committee. Australia's National Research Organisation for Women's Safety, ANROS, this is our national body dedicated to understanding and responding to domestic and family violence, said plainly in their submission that there is no evidence that the reintroduction of mandatory sentencing legislation in the Northern Territory will have positive impacts on or improve the safety of women, children and the broader community. This is the organisation whose sole mandate is to assess what works to keep victims safe. And what does their research tell us? The evidence shows that improvements in safety come from investments outside or alongside the criminal justice system. Madam Speaker, the path to safety is not through blunt instruments like mandatory sentencing. It's through evidence-based programs, early intervention and properly resourced services. The Northern Territory Women's Legal Services, a critical voice on the front lines of this crisis, echoed these concerns. In their submission, they warn that the proposed measures may not only be ineffective in achieving their objectives, but may cause some unintended adverse consequences in relation to victim survivor safety. They also noted that mandatory sentencing is inconsistent with the value our legal system places on judicial discretion and is unlikely to have the desired outcomes of improved victim safety and increased accountability. Why? Because accountability does not come from a formula. It comes from informed case-by-case decision-making by trained judicial officers who understand the dynamics of violence, coercive control, trauma and misidentification. I just want to highlight this point. The NT Women's Legal Services strongly warned us of the real and persistent risk of misidentification, where victim survivors, often Aboriginal women, are wrongly named as perpetrators. They are being placed under domestic violence orders when in fact they are the ones being abused. And under mandatory sentencing, those same women would be automatically jailed if the order is breached, even if the breach was initiated by the abuser, even if it was part of a pattern of coercive control. Is this what we want our justice system to do? To jail victim survivors? Madam Speaker, this is not justice, this is harm. We are told that this clause targets repeat and serious breaches of DVOs, but we already have sentencing tools to deal with this and to deal with serious harm. The Sentencing Act directs judges to impose just sentences in all circumstances. If the courts are not responding appropriately, we need to be strengthening judicial training, not stripping discretion altogether. And we need to address the crisis in our courts. The system is already not working. This will make it collapse. One of the services working with victims sent me this message this morning. Just this week we filed an urgent DVO. Last Monday we filed an urgent DVO. It still hasn't been processed by the court registry. We've been told that the courts have been so overwhelmed that they can't get through the processing. For DVOs that do get listed, it can be up to a month for a first mention. Then they often won't get to the judge in the busy court list. We had one urgent matter held over 3 times before it got to a judge. The mechanism that we have for victim survivor safety, like applying DVOs, are failing because the system is not working fast enough and in the way it should. This bill will not address that. I note that the member for 𝘼𝙄𝙇 talked about the small group of people agitating for the protection of perpetrators rather than victims. And I remind him that every submission received by the Scrutiny Committee was from an organisation working with and for victims. Services like the NT Women's Legal Services, who provide a clear alternative, they call on government to invest in specialist training and domestic, family and sexual violence-informed judicial education, increase resourcing for women's legal and support services, greater access to behaviour change programs for those who use violence, and implementation of the recommendations from the NT Coroner's domestic violence inquests, including alternatives to custody, co-responder models and wraparound legal and housing support. And I acknowledge and I am grateful and welcome that some of these changes we've heard from the government, they will be happening. Madam Speaker, these are practical proven reforms. They're based in data. We know they're going to work, and this is what we should be doing. These are the reforms that will make women safer, not mandatory sentencing, not populist legal reforms that ignore the evidence and defy the advice of ANROs, the legal services, Aboriginal legal services, frontline workers and other national experts. As I said before, and as ANROs rightly notes, incarceration is not a circuit breaker. It is in too many cases a pressure cooker that leads to escalated risk when a person is released, and often leads to reoffending and reharming someone, not rehabilitation. The NT coroner warned us in the recent inquest, one of the most dangerous times for a woman is just after the perpetrator is released from custody, and the aspect of this bill that addresses that I welcome. But this bill also guarantees that risk, that short stints of jail time will be followed by even more dangerous behaviour. Let me remind this House, when mandatory sentencing for property offences was introduced in the Northern Territory in the late 1990s, crime increased. When it was repealed, crime declined. We've done this before and we know how it ends. And the costs, financial and human, are staggering. It costs more than $122,000 per person per year to imprison someone in the NT. With that same money, one person, with that same money we could fund an entire men's behaviour change program, support a full-time legal advocate in a remote community, or provide safe housing for multiple families fleeing violence. Madam Speaker, this is a choice between what looks tough and what actually works, a choice between populist responses and principled, evidence-based reform, a choice between harm and healing. Let me conclude with the words of 𝘼𝑗𝑻 once more. We understand the necessity for rapid improvements in safety for women, children and communities, but we raise our concern about the government's current position that incarceration will improve safety. It won't. It doesn't, and we shouldn't pretend that it will. I call on the government not to pass this bill with mandatory sentencing in place. Remove the clause, invest in what works, strengthen judicial discretion, don't undermine it, and act with the courage to make decisions not because they're politically popular, but because they will actually make all of our communities safer. And I note that should this government choose to ignore all the evidence on mandatory sentencing and pass this bill in full, I call on it to establish a published monitoring report on the impacts of the reform so that we can see if, as the CLP says, these new laws will actually work to protect victims and keep us safer. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Honourable members, I advise of the presence in the gallery of young adults from YouthWorks, accompanied by their teacher. Welcome to Parliament House. Member for Blaine.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I rise this morning to speak about this bill and more broadly on the issues of domestic violence. Madam Speaker, anyone who's grown up in the Territory is sadly all too familiar with the scene, the tragic scene of men beating women in public, at the shops, on the streets, outside schools, outside corner stores. It's sadly something that has become so common that many long-term Territorians have become desensitised to it. And I do remind those listening that there are mandatory reporting requirements around domestic violence. So if you do see it, please call the police and make a report. That's just so important. But it is sadly become part of life in the Territory, particularly under the former Labor government, that this scene was just so common. And particularly in my electorate of Blaine, Madam Speaker, where I have many people staying in public housing, fleeing from domestic violence. And in Palmerston, we have a few safe houses where women who are fleeing domestic violence are able to go and be safe and secure from the perpetrators to get some respite. And I've met some of the workers in that space and I commend them. It's a very, very hard job. But they still turn up to work every day because they are committed to those women, those victim survivors, those children. I've spoken before in this House about my own experience with domestic violence, so I won't go over that again, but I have intimate knowledge of what it's like for children to grow up in a home where that is occurring and to see it happen in people that you know very well, friends and family members. And I'll credit to the member for 𝘼𝙂𝙇. He's right, it is alcohol exacerbates, but there are underlying attitudes and behaviours that do need addressing there. But still, it cannot be tolerated. And this government will not tolerate domestic violence. So unlike those opposite who mischaracterised the member for Drysdale words, I would say men's strength is to protect and to provide. So I have 3 boys and I tell them as often as I can because they are strong and the day will come when they'll be stronger than their mum. And the day will come when they'll be stronger than me, but that day has not yet arrived. And so I remind them regularly as they grow in strength, that strength is not to hurt, not to bully, not to harm. It is to protect and to provide for their loved ones and for those more vulnerable than them. It was said in this chamber in the last sittings that last week, that the only, and this was verballing one of the members on this side, that the only thing that could match violence, I can't quite remember the words, but it was the only thing that could go against violence was violence. But unfortunately, the situation we're in is, what do you call police? When you have a violent person who is threatening severe harm to those loved ones that are close to them or to members of the community, and we call the police, they don't use nice words. They start with nice words, but if there is no compliance, they will eventually have no choice but to take that person into custody against their will with the use of force. So violence, sadly, is a part of the discussion, but it is important that it is shaped and framed and used legitimately by those who are sworn to serve and protect society, and by men in society to protect and provide for their family and to keep them safe. I was there at the markets 2 dry seasons ago when the member for Drysdale's family was surrounded by a group of juveniles engaging in what can only be described as a riot. And he swept up his family and formed a human shield with his own body to protect his wife and his 2 little girls. That is a demonstration of strength to protect his family. I'd like to now speak about the role of domestic violence orders. So I've had the dubious honour, the sadness, to know some people who have been on both sides of domestic violence orders. These are a key legal instrument to keep women safe when they reach the point where they realise that their loved one, the person who promised to love and cherish them, is causing so much harm to them that they have to go to the police and go to the courts in order to feel safe. Now, these domestic violence orders are an order of the court. Unfortunately, as has been well documented, if someone has so little regard for their loved one, so little regard for the court and police and the laws of society and good decency, that they are willing to breach that domestic violence order and go back and re-perpetrate harm against that loved one, there needs to be a strong response. There needs to be a circuit breaker. And very often, it is, Member for Johnston, I agree, when the legal system gets involved in a domestic dispute, there's often an increased risk of harm in the immediate aftermath. The person can be angry, upset, not thinking clearly, and wanting to lash out. And the person they will most want to lash out at is the person they blame for this domestic violence order, their partner. At this time, it is critically important that their partner is safe from them. Because if they breach that domestic violence order, the chances of them inflicting serious harm is increased many times. And I support this bill because I argue to this House that mandatory sentencing is an important and critical circuit breaker for women survivors in order to take the time, 7 days at least, hopefully, to get their affairs in order, to find a safe house. So the people that I've known who've gone through this, when they get a domestic violence order, that the planning that goes into their escape from their predicament, you would not believe. They're often tangled in all kinds of webs of financial control, physical control, coercive control. To escape from this scenario is a huge effort, and I take my hat off. I commend these women who plan for weeks, months, sometimes years to get out of these circumstances. And when they escape, their partner can be very, very angry and seeking to lash out. I've heard threats of them taking their guns and killing the woman, killing the children, and killing themselves. This is the sort of thing that women have to deal with when they come to the realisation that the person who promised to love and cherish them is now their greatest source of danger. And if they breach that DV, if they breach that domestic violence order, if we let them straight back out and they're now facing a charge over their heads and all kinds of consequences, and they've already found the woman because they're able to breach the domestic violence order against her, what do you think they're going to do? It is critical to put a circuit breaker in place, again, so that the woman has time to seek shelter, to seek a safe place to stay, to get her affairs in order, to move her things out. Just really basic logistics, getting out of that shared domestic home so that she can sleep comfortably at night and hopefully in a place where her abuser does not know where she is or the children. So I want to talk briefly about how we ended up in the position where this government is here restoring mandatory sentencing for domestic violence offenders or people who breach domestic violence orders. So the previous Labor government, I'll say, back in 2019, they had a pattern of watering down the laws to put the rights of offenders over the rights of victims. This was a pattern across many areas of legislation, many areas of law. And so I briefly want to speak about the point where they dipped their toe in the water. The Justice Legislation Amendment, Domestic and Family Violence Bill, Serial 113, that was debated on Thursday, the 25th of June, 2020. And I want to read out some comments that the now Chief Minister made at the time regarding that bill. She said at the time, and I'm reading from Hansard, I place firmly on the record, but we have strong concerns based on the feedback we received in the committee proceedings from Women's Legal Service about how this will operate because it provides an alternative to mandatory sentencing without adequate safeguards that ought to go with such a change in position. Further down, in a nutshell, the components of the bill we are concerned about would allow a domestic violence offender to be bailed to a rehabilitative program and allow the court the discretion to deem completion of that program as an exceptional circumstance, potentially meaning the offender would not go on to undertake their sentence. Now, the member for 𝘼𝙄𝙇 in his contribution today, I think, said that it takes, correct me if I'm wrong, you want 12 months. You need a significant amount of time in order for a men's behaviour change program to really take root in someone. Now my understanding, when I was campaigning, I was talking to police and they were saying that one of the programs that end up getting implemented for this piece of legislation was a 16-hour course with Tanganjia, and the courts would consider that exceptional and then bail them. 16 weeks. 16 weeks? I was told 16 hours by police. I hope it was 16 weeks. So that was dipping their toe in the water about watering down mandatory sentencing for domestic violence offenders. Then in 2023, they went all the way with the Justice Legislation Amendment, Domestic and Family Violence Bill 2023, by the member for 𝘼𝙂𝙼 when he was the Attorney General, perhaps the worst Attorney General in the history of the Northern Territory, as he oversaw the absolute destruction of our legal system, NARJA, legal aid, neglect of our corrections system, shutting down the prison industries in corrections, and failing to invest for the growing prisoner numbers that he was aware of. So if it's better to release domestic violence offenders to rehab, then where were these rehab programs? So this morning, I had a quick look at today's court lists. Now, this is not an authoritative academic study. It's just a N=1 sample of today, but I think it's representative. So we had 101 domestic violence matters before the courts around the Northern Territory today. That's between Darwin, Alice Springs, communities, Katherine, Tennant Creek, all over the Northern Territory. 101. So that represents 101 domestic violence orders that are being considered by the courts today. There are 66 charges of engage in conduct that contravenes DVO before the courts today. 66 charges. That is a river of domestic violence offending that would require, even for 16 weeks, a huge amount of programs. And I'm not an expert in that area. I'll wait for the Minister for Domestic Violence in her response. She might have some more information on this matter. But I was not aware, as a citizen of the Northern Territory, of any kind of programs of that scale and nature that would protect or even function as a circuit breaker for women in the Northern Territory. Detention is not ideal. No one on this side is saying that detention is ideal. It is not. But it is essential to keep the community safe. It is essential to keep women safe. It is essential to keep children safe. It's better than what the previous government was doing for victims, which was nothing or next to nothing. This government is different. We will continue to put the rights of victims above those of offenders. We will continue to protect women and children, give them the time they need to seek shelter, move out of their circumstances, set themselves up for safety, engage in family safety frameworks, the programs that the police and the courts have in order to keep them safe. For that reason, I support this bill and I commend it to the House. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member for Drysdale.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I stand to speak on this bill as this is a very important issue, especially in the electorate of Drysdale, in which we unfortunately do have a large number of domestic violence and sexual violence and family violence occur. Which is why I'm very committed to stepping forward and also do believe male leadership is needed in this space, and I intend to continue in that pursuit, Madam Speaker. In line with that, I spoke last week very sincerely about some ideas and thoughts I have that could work, and we've heard the opposition call for bipartisanship. I would ask them to act accordingly as well, and that I do believe there's a lot of ideas in here, and we do need to work together in this space. So I do receive a very large number of domestic violence. I'd say it's usually once people have decided to actually leave is when they will come into my office, or if they are chasing justice for historical abuse. And so I know there is a large number of people that would be currently being impacted and victims of coercive control, manipulation, we'll call it financial violence, financial abuse. And these are all forms of violence, which, as the member for 𝘼𝙂𝙇 did discuss, and I do agree that it is a very large range there's a very large spectrum of family violence that occurs. I also I get a lot of information from neighbours who come in as they report they report their neighbour who's abusing their partners, their children. And so regardless of what the data says, which is shocking as itself, I know through my own personal experience in the electorate that it is at a shocking rate. I will also acknowledge too that DV does happen to both genders. However, there is a vast difference to the damage that a man can inflict. And that is where, for me, yes, domestic violence can happen to men. I've worked in the welfare space with the military as well, and men can certainly have severe damage both emotionally and physically. However, the vast majority is perpetrated by men. And if you look at just the size of myself to some of my colleagues, I'll compare me and the member for 𝘼𝙂𝙼𝙄𝙉𝙍. It's quite simple, Madam Speaker. A man can do and cause such horrendous damage when domestic violence is carried out. And so, let's face reality, men. Let's face the reality. I speak about the strength that a man has and the responsibilities that come with that. That is also facing this issue, and that when men perpetrate domestic violence, particularly to women, they can and they will do much more severe damage. And so, as men, we must face that, and we must challenge each other and remind each other what it means to be a man, Madam Speaker. Because domestic violence, in my eyes, has no place in what it means to be a man and what it means to be masculine. I do support this legislation as it targets people breaching and repeatedly breaching their DVOs. And let's remind ourselves why DVOs are in place. They have been put there to lower the risk of reoffending, and so I have no issue in giving those measures some teeth for enforcement, and so that when perpetrators break their DVOs, they know there will be a consequence. And it goes back to a core message of our government, which is essentially a philosophical standpoint that we believe there should be consequence for action. And so if you break those orders, and that you would knowingly break those orders, there will be consequences. And I think that's a very important aspect. We discussed time of punishment. We could discuss time of punishment all day, and I stand on the point that probably further than most would in the chamber, in that serious times of punishment is needed to induce change. However, I support the fact that there will be at least a minimum of time now to let people know that what they've done is wrong. And so, Madam Speaker, when we're left with this scourge on our society of domestic violence, why is the home breaking down? The Country Liberal Party, at its core, believes in the family home being fundamental to a healthy society. And that family home evolves, it changes, as time's gone on, and how that looks, how it's made up, but it still doesn't change what that family home means to a healthy society. And that's where we're raising our children, and where places of safety, love and nurture and education for our children. And it is why I'm so supportive of those traditional family values. And I don't mean in the traditional makeup, I mean in the traditional values that is enshrined in the home. And we need to be pushing that, and this bill speaks to that. We're saying if you threaten the sanctity of the safety of that home, then the law will punish you. And I think that's quite an important piece. People need to know that we as a government value the sanctity of that home, and we will take actions against anyone who does threaten it. And it's important for our children to know that as well. Our children need to know, especially the ones who today, and unfortunately, in probably every single person's electorate here, there will be children who view domestic family violence in one of its many forms. And so we need to send a message to them too, so that they know what a parent is doing or a carer is doing is not right. So, Madam Speaker, I thank the Minister for her work. I thank the Minister for her ongoing advocacy and tenacity for change in this space. I welcome the reforms, and I welcome our government's approach. I myself will continue to learn more, I will continue to advocate, and I will continue to attempt to be a man that stands up in this space and pushes for change that we need to have. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member for Ńycliffe.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise today to give my contribution on the government's Domestic and Family Violence and Victims Legislation Amendment Bill. I want to start by responding to some of the things that we've heard in this chamber so far today. One particularly around the idea that there are a minority of loud voices that supposedly support perpetrators over victims. I have no idea who those voices are. I have not heard anyone calling for support of perpetrators over the rights of victims. But if by this those members are talking about frontline services and experts who are speaking out against some of the moves by this government, and then that's quite frankly insulting, and it shows to me that the members saying these things have actually never had a conversation with people working on the front line to defend these victims, let alone actually listen to anything they're saying. There is also something here that many of us, victim survivors, are finding fairly aggravating, to be honest, and that is some of the sentiment by those opposites, suddenly trying to convince us that they really care about victims, when we, victim survivors, and those who dedicate their lives to protecting women and children have been holding vigils and marches for the women killed by men, and mostly Aboriginal women, and not once in the 7 years that I've been here attending these vigils in the NT have I seen a single member of the CLP attend. The only time I have is when post getting elected, I've seen 2 members attend a vigil. Granted, I haven't been to every single one, but me and my community as part of victim survivors have been constantly marching, vigils, every time a woman is called, so it feels extremely grating to us to hear all this just incredibly insincere when they weren't, where were they? They weren't there. So excuse me if the sincerity of those opposite to support victims now seems pretty unconvincing to us because they've been completely absent up until now. Now look, as a victim survivor myself, I take this topic extremely seriously. I know what it means to physically run in fear from someone who wants to hurt you. And when I visited Dawn House recently, the incredible refuge that our Minister for Domestic Violence is still yet to meet after 9 months of being in the role, there I was told about the increase in sophistication in, for example, tracking devices that men are using to track their victims. Tracking devices hidden in cars and in children's toys. And the terror of this really hit me in the gut. But I know that even with my life experience, I must turn to those who actually work in this field for guidance on what the evidence says will work. Because that is all I want to do, Madam Speaker. Genuinely, all I want is to support something that actually works. And I take my role here incredibly seriously, so therefore I take being proactive with reaching out and listening very seriously. Recently, one of the conversations I had with a senior and experienced frontline worker in the domestic violence sector on this bill was really helpful for me to better understand the whole picture of the reality of the proposals like this. So she spoke to me about the realities of working in domestic violence in regional and remote parts of the NT and how that is very different to other parts of Australia, particularly urban centres and areas interstate. She said that many people think that when a man is convicted of DV, the women and possibly her children escape. They move, change their names, move on, and the man is imprisoned for a length of time. The reality is that most often, both the victim and perpetrator are living in a small community where everyone knows everyone. The woman does not and should not have to leave her entire family and support network. So often they're still there, having to maintain a relationship, and these victim survivors often having to manage the perpetrator for when they're eventually released. And many of them speak with fear about the changes that happen to these men, getting angrier and more violent after being brutalised in prison with no rehabilitation. But don't get me wrong, she did speak about the fact that incarceration can be part of a proper DV response in terms of giving the victim a break. But that option already exists and is already used. We already imprison DV perpetrators. Judges use that if deemed necessary. Mandatory sentencing, however, which is in this bill, is something completely different. And what I've learnt is detrimental to the positive outcomes in this space for reasons I will detail. Now, look, I understand how tempting and how good it feels to stand up and give platitudes about standing strong in the face of violence and giving platitudes about zero tolerance. But those platitudes are actually just empty if they don't actually make anything better. It feels good to say those things because they're easy things to say. But sometimes taking the easiest route is not the correct one. It's actually just lazy. And the truth lives down a more complex, nuanced path. As they say, if it's worth doing, then it will be hard. And if it's not hard, it's probably not worth doing. Domestic, sexual and family violence is at a crisis point in the Northern Territory. But the voices of experts and people with lived experience are so absent in this bill. Those opposite have shown time and time again that their policies are driven by their own ideologies, what will they think will make a good headline, rather than what will actually have a meaningful long-term impact on reducing violence. I echo the concerns of the sector that this bill is being rushed through without proper consultation and consideration. Unlike other legislation the CLP has rushed through Parliament, this bill did at least go to a scrutiny committee for feedback and assessment. However, with no hearings and the consultation process falls far short of proper process. It is not clear to me that the government has taken on board the feedback of experts and victim survivors. And as such, I cannot and will not support this bill at this time. My primary concern... Sorry, I want to pick up on that interjection. Is that disgrace? Was that the word that I just said? Oh, what a surprise. Okay, what a surprise.
Come on. Comments through me, please.
Through the chair. I mean, this kind of dismissiveness, I'm standing here and genuinely giving a good faith read on that I have sat down, I've talked, I've reached out to centres that your own domestic violence minister has not met with. I am just simple. So I am taking this seriously and in good faith. And if they want to have these sarcastic surprise, it just tells me a whole lot more about them than it does about me. Mandatory sentencing and judicial discretion. My primary concern is that the current bill proposes the reintroduction of mandatory sentencing and removes the discretion of the court to consider the individual circumstances of the case. And this is a concern that is held very widely across the territory, this idea of the separation of powers and the kind of motivations of a government that wants to put tighter and tighter controls on the judiciary. They're supposed to be separated for a reason. The appropriate exercise of judicial discretion is an essential function of our justice system and our democracy, and I am concerned by the infringement that this bill has on the separation of powers. I urge the government to listen to the calls of the sector and to ensure that our judiciary is supported and trained to be able to make informed decisions about domestic violence. And you know what? If it is such a surprise that I'm constantly calling to listen to evidence, then I'm glad that's not a surprise. I'm glad I'm up here all the time saying, let's listen to evidence, let's listen to victim survivors' voices, because it's so often missing with this government. I stand in solidarity with the sector in opposing the introduction of mandatory sentencing for domestic violence offences and call on the government to listen to the experts and victim survivors. There is a mountain of evidence indicating that mandatory sentencing of DFV offenders does not work to reduce violence. Coroner Elizabeth Armitage has said that this insidious violence is a crisis that we cannot arrest our way out of. It's an enormously complex social issue that requires a holistic approach centred on prevention and rehabilitation. I would like to take a moment to outline the evidence provided in submissions to the Scrutiny Committee as to why mandatory sentencing should be opposed. And I will note too that I went into this looking to learn, looking to listen. I was very interested to see the submissions and to see that all of them written were of the same view from the people that have been doing this for decades. What is the point of having a Scrutiny Committee if the government looks at all of these unanimous submissions and goes, nah, we reckon opposite? Like, it's so frustrating. First, evidence shows that imprisonment does not actually act as a deterrent to crime. It's been said many times, but warrants repeating. If imprisonment worked, the NT would be the safest place in Australia. But our prisons are overflowing and nothing has changed. In NARG's submission on this bill, they made the point that, quote, there is no clear evidentiary basis for the proposition that mandatory sentencing reduces reoffending. Rather, this approach increases the number of people in custody without delivering better outcomes for victim survivors or communities, end quote. To keep our communities safe and thriving, we need to prevent violence from happening in the first place, and mandatory imprisonment is not the answer. Second, evidence shows that once someone goes to prison, they are more likely to offend again and end up back there, and we need to ensure that imprisonment is used as last resort. Like I said before, the sector does acknowledge, or the people that I've spoken to, that imprisonment is part of it in terms of giving women a break, but the mandatory sentencing is not what will work. The judges cannot give sentences to imprisonment, and they do. The NT has the highest recidivism rate in Australia, with almost 60% of offenders returning to prison, which tells us that something is broken in this system. Our prisons are not rehabilitative. They encourage further criminal behaviour. We can't take someone out of a bad situation, provide them with no rehabilitational support, and put them back into the same situation expecting a different outcome. Third, putting offenders in prison is a terrible use of taxpayer money. Government boasted last week when they released their budget that there is a record spend on corrections. And I'll say it again, this is not something to be proud of. It shows that we are failing to prevent crime. We are failing to prevent reoffending. In their submission, Stopping Family Violence, a peak DFE peak body, made the point that the cost of imprisoning someone for 14 days costs the same amount as to put them through a full men's behaviour change program. These are the kinds of programs we need to be focusing on to prevent people ending up in prison again, and more importantly, to stop violence from happening. Apology. Also, one of the largest red flags that I've heard from the sector is that with a poor understanding of domestic family violence, with racism, over-policing, communication and language barriers and poverty, and other factors, it means that victim survivors may be mistaken for perpetrators of violence and end up in custody themselves. This is something that happens somewhat frequently and is a real danger. Our inflexible systems mean that people who are actually victims of domestic family violence may end up labelled perpetrators on DVOs. Then if they breach them for financial security, family, cultural reasons, then they end up incarcerated themselves, the victims. Now, this will be exacerbated by the removal of judicial discretion in this bill. This is exactly why judicial discretion exists. Judges need to be able to assess matters on a case-by-case basis to ensure that they are not misidentifying victim survivors as perpetrators. And I really must stress this one. The frontline workers I spoke to used the word, quote, terrifying, that the thought of victims being caught up when mandatory sentencing is terrifying and a terrible miscarriage of justice. And this will now undoubtedly occur under this bill. We need to move away from police and prisons as the answer to crime and focus on ensuring victim survivors have the support and agency they need to be able to get out of violent situations. We need to focus on building more housing, on behaviour change programs, on specialist training of police to prevent misidentification of victims as offenders, and improving access to interpreters and culturally safe support systems to ensure that DVOs work to protect victims rather than punish them. And finally, as noted above, mandatory sentencing may lead to underreporting of violence or DVO breaches. This is something I also heard from people working particularly in remote areas. The idea of mandatory reporting stops women from reporting because they don't want pushback or retribution from the offender and family. Evidence suggests that victim survivors will be at higher risk of being coerced or manipulated into not reporting violence because the offender would be compulsorily imprisoned. As I said, we need to ensure that victim survivors have the culturally safe supports that they need to be able to safely report violence and get access to justice and care that they deserve. And from what I have learned and understood, mandatory sentencing will not achieve that. And that is my concern. Madam Speaker, I am so concerned that rather than listening to experts and people with lived experience to tackle this crisis, this government is content to let the issue get worse. I urge the government to shift their focus away from imprisonment and towards rehabilitation, prevention and support. The second element of this bill that I do have some concerns over is some of the changes to the assessment of victims' compensation. The bill proposes that non-legally qualified people will be able to assess victims' compensation claims. Although I did see there was an amendment this morning to that, but it still seemed rather broad terms in terms of the qualification of someone that is able to make that decision. Victims' compensation assessments require assessment of complex legal issues, and as such it is essential they are conducted by appropriately legally trained professionals. Incorrect or inconsistent applications of the law have real and lasting impacts on people's lives. It is essential that these processes are efficient. However, this can't come at the expense of quality and integrity of decisions. So we need, once again, to listen to the sector, who have highlighted in their submissions a number of approaches that would help to streamline this process without negatively impacting victim survivors. And the final matter I'd like to draw attention to is in relation to the expansion of the current requirements of the Crime Victim Service Unit to notify victims on the Victims Register when an offender has failed to comply with electronic monitoring condition. I stand with the sector in supporting victim survivors' access to information. I do agree that it's important and I'm glad to see that. But from the submissions, I could see there's a need for the government to ensure that the service is sufficiently resourced to maintain contact with and support those on the Victims Register. I also join the calls of NT Women's Legal Service in ensuring the delivery of the Victims Register is trauma-informed to ensure the information sharing does not trigger or traumatise victim survivors. We need to ensure that this reform is implemented alongside specialist DFE services to support victim survivors to get the information they're entitled to in a way that is safe and trauma-informed. Madam Speaker, I ask the government to take a cautious and evidence-informed approach to this issue, and I call on the government to not rush through this bill today and instead review and consider evidence provided from the sector that was provided in the Scrutiny Committee and amend the bill accordingly. Thank you.
Member for Mulca.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to speak on the Domestic and Family Violence and Victims Legislation Amendment Bill 2025. I support an approach to family violence that includes good consultation with our communities, elders and leaders, so that we can work together to address these tragedy of violence within families. Madam Speaker, I have said these things before in the chamber, and I will say them again today. We must draw from our communities and domestic violence services and workers about what solutions will bring real change. Madam Speaker, I have said clearly before that domestic violence is unlawful, and it is unlawful as part of our Yolngu law, and it is unlawful as part of Balanda law. And we must work together to address this problem. In remote communities, we need elders and leaders, men and women, to be part of these solutions. We need decision-making power and our rights to self-determination. When I stand here in every parliament session, I talk about refugee camps the peacekeepers. This is what I am talking about. I am talking about preventing family violence with culturally appropriate interventions that should bring long-lasting harmony. We must have domestic violence. We must have domestic violence orders. Then they need to include clan leaders, and for clan leaders from each of the parties' clans, so that we can set the terms and conditions to help a victim be safe. Sometimes the police and the Balanda involvement do not set the best condition. They do not include the extended family in a conference together, so that clans can work together to bring safety. Traditionally, male and female ceremonies have brought education to our young people, but about respectful relationships, marriage, and building strong families. This education is inbuilt in our law, but today young people may not get this teaching, and they are marrying and becoming parents very young. We are seeing young people, uneducated couples who need more support and cultural appropriate information about how to be respectful. This is what refugee camps and peacekeeping is all about. The boys' circumcision ceremony, when they are about 9 to 10 years old, is the beginning of these education processes. The sounds of clapsticks, the singing, the paintings on skin, and feathers that the boys wear are the artifacts of law. It is these things that children wear that remind him of the learning, self-discipline, and looking after kin and country. This is the beginning of the law that teaches a boy who is becoming a young man about respectful relationship. These teachings also happen for the young men, These teachings also happen to young women with their female elders. These are the teachings that have been part of our culture. So I am upset and frustrated when I hear people say that Aboriginal culture causes violence. Family violence is not part of our culture. Elders and leaders do not want to see violence in our communities, but the Balanda solutions in our remote communities are not working. DBOs, courts and prison terms are not helping to heal the deep problems in our communities. They are like a Band-Aid that allows a sore to fester and spread infection underneath. We need to find better solutions to help women and families who need protection and ensure that the solutions are long-lasting, so that the perpetrators are taken into a culturally appropriate program that are about rehabilitation and healing. For these perpetrators who have a problem with drug and alcohol, we need to have culturally appropriate programs that are about drug rehabilitation on country. We need to have elders and leaders running these programs where these things are not working. We can move perpetrators away from the victim of a community and onto a country elsewhere, and bring peace through separation if there is no other solution. Leaders and elders have many ways of managing these problems. We have to be part of the solution, working with families for real outcomes. Family violence is not part of our culture, but we have been disempowered to take action against it because we are no longer the authority. Police, court, and jails have become the authority in our communities, and this means we rarely get rehabilitation and healing because intervention does not connect with our law. Our remote elders and communities need the government to understand that reprieve camp, 𝘽𝙂𝙼𝙼 mediators, peacekeepers, our ceremonies of law run by male and female elders should be a appropriate priority of this government if it wants to see healing and harmony in our communities. Madam Speaker, I note that all of the submissions to the scrutiny committee are not in agreement with this bill. These are the service experts, and they are also being ignored in their advice. And they acknowledge that our leaders are also ignored. CAFLO and NAFLS state their submission. We wish to express our disappointment regarding the lack of meaningful consultation and the limited time frame provided to respond to this bill. We are particularly concerned that the bill fails adequately include our reflect the voice, or adequately include or reflect the voices of Aboriginal women. Their families, communities, and ACCOs work in the DFSV sector. Submission 13 from the Northern Territory Women's Lawyers Association, the Criminal Lawyers Association of the Northern Territory, and the Law Society Northern Territory stated that the bill has been developed without adequate consultation from sector experts. It is inconsistent with the findings of the 2024 anti-coroner's inquiries in the deaths of 4 Aboriginal women due to domestic violence, and fails to address social determinants and root causes of DFV, domestic violence, including inadequate housing, from insecurity and insufficient access to culturally safe services. Madam Speaker, there are many more submissions that raise similar concerns, including the issues that mandatory sentencing may be very damaging in these cases, because it does not include community, it does not include rehabilitation, and it makes the victim less safe. I have also have grave concerns about the other incarceration of Aboriginal people in a failing jail system that is causing a high level of trauma. Madam Speaker, this bill is not supported widely across the community. I am unsure why the government are continuing to change the law. This bill does not bring changes that will help our communities. Rather, it will contribute to the problems, and until the government start listening to the communities and the service providers, these problems will only get worse, and they do not seem to care that there will be more victims and more harm. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member for Catherine.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I rise to speak on the Domestic Family and Family Violence and Victims Legislation Amendment Bill 2025. Madam Speaker, much has been said about domestic and family sexual violence. The Minister has spoken many times in the House about the challenges of the hard work she's been doing working with key stakeholders in the sector. It is a key priority of our government to put in place proactive measures to respond to and prevent domestic, family and sexual violence, and these reforms will ensure victims can be notified when an offender breaches various orders. Another election commitment that our government is delivering on to reduce crime, keep our communities safe, reduce the financial burden on the economy and support our Territory lifestyle, where Territorians can live and feel safe in their own homes, at their workplace and in communities they live in. These reforms are another strong step forward to ensure the safety of victims is strengthened, to ensure those offenders that do not comply with their mandated orders are faced with consequences. Madam Speaker, we saw domestic violence grow out of control under 8 years of Labor, who removed mandatory sentencing for domestic violence offences. Under our new mandatory sentencing regime, the court must now sentence an offender to an actual term of imprisonment, where an offender breaches an existing DVO and harm was involved, or a threat of harm was involved against the victim. Sorry, I missed a sentence there. I'll just go back. Under our new mandatory sentence regime, the court must now sentence an offender to an actual term of imprisonment where an offender breaches an existing DVO and harm was involved, or a threat of harm was involved against the victim. An offender breaches their DVO and has a prior breach of a DVO, or a situation where the offender has repeatedly breached their DVO in a short amount of time, 28 days. Madam Speaker, our changes have also expanded the Victims Register to ensure that more information is shared with victims about their offenders. Previously, the Crime Victim Service Unit, which manages the Victims Register, could only provide information about a victim offender when they were sentenced to a term of imprisonment. Victims should have the right to be notified if their offender removes or cuts their electronic monitoring device. Victims should be notified if their offender does not show up to parole orders or conditions. Madam Speaker, victims should be notified if they do not comply with a mandated intensive community corrections order. Victims should have more rights and transparency, Madam Speaker. They have endured enough in just becoming that, a victim. Our government, by making these changes, will at least provide increased peace of mind and increased trust in being safe. Offenders have no more excuses, chances, or no one else to blame but themselves. This is why we are here today, Madam Speaker, to stop violence before it begins. Sadly, the Northern Territory has the highest reported rates of domestic, family and sexual violence in Australia, particularly for Aboriginal women and children. And under the previous government, we saw an increase of 81% in domestic violence-related offences. We've also modernised the Victims of Crime Assistance Act, and as a result, the Victims of Crime levy will increase, which means more money available to be used for victims' services. The coronial inquiries into DV deaths of Territory women found that, according to the NT Police Force, there was a 117% increase in the number of domestic and family violence calls in the past decade. Madam Speaker, since the beginning of 2025, 3 more women are reported to have been killed by a partner or ex-partner in domestic family violence-related circumstances in the Territory. Just last year, we saw in Katherine 4 women lose their life to domestic violence. These ladies were someone's mother, sister, auntie or friend. They were 4 ladies that had their lives cut short through the actions of another over domestic violence. A key priority of our government is preventing and responding to domestic, family and sexual violence. We can all agree, I'm sure, that no Territorian should be subject to any form of domestic or family violence. It is just unacceptable. Over my time as the member for Katherine, we have spoken often about domestic violence issues and how better to support programs. To do this, we need a whole-of-government coordination and investment in primary prevention, early intervention, response, recover and healing, and systemic enablers. And it was good to hear the member for 𝑨𝑮𝑻 and the opposition leader talking about that, support. Madam Speaker, I also bring to your attention that one of the main contributing factors to homelessness in our nation is a result of domestic and family violence, with nearly 30% of individuals that are at risk stating this as their primary reason for seeking help. Madam Speaker, help is what we need to provide these women and families experiencing domestic, family and sexual violence. Help that is offered selflessly by our own Territorians, like the new outreach worker program at the 𝘼𝙂𝙼𝙄𝙇 Short Stay Accommodation and Homelessness Facility located at Baton Road. Hope is what our government is committed to delivering, providing more funding for remote women's safe houses, hope in their time of desperate need, towards a better future, which includes providing Aboriginal employment, pathways to a better life and pathways to recovery. Violence against women in the NT has an alarming and unacceptable high rate. We are committed to investing an additional $36 million per year ongoing from 2025-26 to address funding shortfalls and build a more sustainable domestic, family and sexual violence service system. The Minister has spoken continuously each Parliament sittings over this. The Australian Government and Northern Territory Government have signed a new national partnership agreement which will see an additional $6.635 million for domestic, family and sexual violence responses to be delivered over the next 5 years. In addition, a further $53 million from the Australian Government will be received by the Northern Territory over the next 5 years through the NT RAY program for remote women's safe houses. Madam Speaker, continued and additional investment in service and programs that work to prevent and address domestic, family and sexual violence is what our government is committed to. Prevention programs stop violence before it begins. As the Minister for Education, prevention in the early years is paramount to making change. We need to educate our future young Territorians, and that is why I'm committed to ensuring that there are programs in our schools to make certain this happens. I note that the member for 𝘼𝙄𝙇 spoke earlier about some of the programs that happen in schools. We've got the following programs are directly related to primary prevention of domestic violence and are currently in use across educational settings in the Northern Territory. We've got Keeping Safe Child Protection Curriculum developed by SA Department. 21 NT government schools are currently implementing it with 45 trainers across schools and corporate education systems. Resilience, rights and respectful relationships in conjunction with building respectful relationships learning materials developed by the Victorian Department of Education. The 𝘼𝑗𝑗𝑠 and 𝘼𝑗𝑗𝑠 Junior programs delivered by the National Association for Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect. The Girls Can, Boys Can, developed by Tangier Council in Alice Springs. And in Tennant Creek, we've got Talking Respect, developed by It's Time We Talked and Women's Safety Services of Central Australia. Madam Speaker, let me ask everyone here, have you ever asked your son or daughter, what sort of person do you want to be? Have you had those conversations with your child, your niece, your nephew, making them think about their aspirations from an early age, thinking about who they are and who they want to become? Being a good, kind human, Madam Speaker, that is what we want for everyone, and it needs to start at home. Our government will invest the funding in the services and programs that will make a difference, make these known to Territorians to give them hope, keep them safe and create future pathways for them to continue their lives. Unlike the previous Labor government, who consistently decreased funding to the Office of Domestic and Family and Violence Reduction, we were not transparent in how the funding was allocated. How positive and uplifting it is to know that the Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence Worker Outreach Program has helped 27 victim survivors since it started in October 2024. That's 27 Territorians that asked for and were provided with help through our government. This service alone is making a difference in the lives of Territorians, providing through personalised care, helping Territorians move forward towards safer, sustainable, long-term housing solutions. And Madam Speaker, as the member for Katherine, I'm committed to ensuring that our community is supported and equipped with the facilities and services to be able to work towards preventing and addressing domestic, family and sexual violence. I've met with staff over my time as the member for Katherine of the Women's Crisis Facility that has 25 beds available. For the past 2 years, this centre has been completely full, at times accessing rooms in hotels to stem the overflow. In the past financial year, 239 women had to be turned away because of capacity constraints. With demands so high, the centre has been forced to prioritise victims who have been really physically harmed. I think we need to think about that, Madam Speaker. When a 19-year-old woman walked into the Katherine Women's Crisis Centre for help years ago, when Jo Gamble was there, she's now no longer there, but when I was speaking to her, she said, saying that the person that walked in asking for help, saying her partner had pushed her, the staff remember feeling excited about the fact that somebody actually had come in and had acknowledged the fact that that was not okay behaviour. And it's not okay, Madam Speaker, to have been stabbed or to have 2 black eyes or beaten with a weapon, whether it be a metal pole or a fist. None of this is okay. None of these actions should be tolerated or accepted as normal behaviour by any woman or man. If that same 19-year-old walked into the Women's Crisis Centre today, Jo had said to me while she was still there, and I note that there's a new manager there at the moment, she would have likely these days, Madam Speaker, that young person, that young 19-year-old woman that walked in asking for help would have been turned away because they just don't have the space. That is a shame. The NT has the worst domestic and family violence rates in Australia, with an intimate partner homicide rate 7 times that of the national average. And in the town of Katherine, service providers are saying the domestic violence crisis has reached new heights. It has led to frontline services sounding the alarm over the safety of women in Katherine and renewing calls for an injection of funding. The average woman stays in the centre for about 10 days, but some women stay for months if they don't have a safe exit option. Service providers say the lack of short-term accommodation options in Katherine means women are often faced with difficult choices when they are released from the shelter. Now, note, Madam Speaker, the shelter has plans for expanding, and I welcome that, and I look forward to seeing that more in the future. In closing, Madam Speaker, I look forward to the Minister's work in this area and look forward to programs like the Circuit Breaker expanding and making meaningful change in the prevention space and starting from the ground up, investing in prevention. Thank you.
Member for Port Darwin.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I stand in support of the amendments before our Parliament today to strengthen our laws to protect the victims of domestic, family and sexual violence. But firstly, I'd like to address the member for Nightcliffe's comments that she had never seen any member of the CLP at a domestic violence rally or event prior to the election. Madam Speaker, I didn't know the member for Nightcliffe before Parliament. I would have no idea if she was an event I ever attended in the 30 years I have lived in the Territory, because I had no idea who she was. So for her to make such a derogatory, sweeping statement about what I may or may not have done in this space in a personal capacity is highly offensive, and I expect my colleagues will feel the same way. She also has zero information about what I did before I lived here. And I would hope she is wise enough to retract that statement. But, Madam Speaker, I think, moving to the bill, at this point in history, after 8 long years of a failed Labor government, domestic violence is out of control in our community. It's out of control because those on the other side fail to make any meaningful change in this space. Madam Speaker, the member for 𝘼𝙄𝙇 spoke about legislative reform undertaken during his term in government. Legislative reform without funding to progress reforms, however, is simply words on paper. They had 8 years to make a commitment to provide ongoing funding to this sector, and they did not. The Whanokiraro CLP government stepped up where those on the other side failed to do so, and has committed a record baseline funding of $36 million per year. This funding is directed toward areas of highest impact and supports innovation, providing critical emergency shelter, legal support and culturally appropriate services for victim survivors of domestic, family and sexual violence. Madam Speaker, it strengthens the capacity of frontline service providers to meet urgent and ongoing needs. Madam Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition stated that the Whanokiraro CLP government's commitment to a record baseline funding of $36 million per year is not enough. Well, Madam Speaker, where was Labor's commitment to dedicated ongoing funding to support this space? If those on the other side were so passionate about addressing the scourge of domestic, family and sexual violence, why did they fail to provide ongoing funding to critical frontline crisis services? Why were 21 non-government organisations providing critical frontline services such as legal services and crisis support only funded to the end of June 2025? I was, however, Madam Speaker, pleased to hear the member for 𝘼𝙄𝙇 call those who blame their behaviour on alcohol cowards, because he's right. Alcohol doesn't cause bad behaviour. What causes bad behaviour is growing up in an environment where violence is used as a method of communication, where communities fail to ensure there are consequences in place for such behaviour, where rather than call out such behaviour, a blind eye is turned because it is simply too hard. We will not see a change in this space until each and every member of each and every community in the Territory stands up and says no more, stands up and holds those who turn to violence in their relationships to account. It will also mean that every dollar that we have to spend in this space achieves results. Madam Speaker, the member for Goy just spoke about men's behaviour change programs and their importance, and he is right. Changing behaviour is key. But he did not speak of the importance of getting those programs right and making sure they are achieving the outcomes that actually see changed behaviour in our community. In other words, he did not provide any detail about outcomes of those programs. Madam Speaker, I have done some work in this space and found that sadly, men's behaviour programs, some of which have been in place for more than a decade, are not delivering the change in behaviour that is our goal. One program had only 147 attendees out of 1,000 referrals over an 8-year period complete the program, and of those who completed the program, more than half reoffended. Whilst it's fantastic that, albeit a small proportion of those completing the program did not reoffend, given the very small number who could be counted as a success, clearly those programs require review given the quantum of funding allocated. Madam Speaker, it is reassuring to hear those on the other side speak in support of components of the amendments before the Parliament, in particular those around victims' rights and compensation for victims. However, I am truly at a loss to understand why those on the other side do not want to see those who pose a risk of immediate harm to a victim put behind bars. Madam Speaker, if a DVO is not worth the paper it is written on because there is no consequence for breaching that DVO, what point is there in issuing a DVO? In November 2022, those on the other side repealed mandatory sentencing for breach of domestic violence order because, according to those on the other side, protecting perpetrators is more important than protecting victims and the community as a whole. Mandatory sentencing puts a consequence, a deterrent in place to let perpetrators know you will have to answer for your actions. Those on the other side would also have us believe there's no evidence that minimum mandatory sentencing does not make victims safer. Well, Madam Speaker, the statistics speak for themselves. For the period December 2021 to November 2022, when minimum mandatory sentencing for breach of DVOs was in place, whilst the number is still horrendously high, there were 6,453 domestic assaults recorded in the NT. The 12 months following the repeal of minimum mandatory sentencing for breach of DVOs, removing the consequence for this heinous behaviour, reported domestic violence assaults increased to 7,827. Clearly, the experts who claim reintroducing this consequence will escalate harm have not done their homework. Madam Speaker, those on the other side constantly talk about consultation. The Leader of the Opposition constantly claims our CLP government is not listening to our community, to our frontline service providers. This could not be further from the truth. Madam Speaker, I have travelled from Darwin to Alice, from Katherine and Tennant Creek to Nhulunbuy and to the Tiwi Islands, speaking with frontline service providers and the community. In all, in the few short months I have held this portfolio, I have consulted with around 50 service providers encompassing crisis response and prevention initiatives. I note the member for Nightcliff claims that she knows people I haven't spoken to. Well, maybe we haven't been able to coordinate a meeting time, or maybe they haven't reached out, or maybe I don't know they exist, but if the member for Nightcliff would like to let me know who they are, I'd be more than happy to add them to the existing list of 50 organisations and people that I've spoken to. What those organisations and community members have told me, Madam Speaker, is that we need to change our approach. We need to focus on root causes as well as crisis response. We need to show our young people a better way, that violence is not the answer. Madam Speaker, the opposition stand and say we are not listening to the experts. We are listening, but we may not always agree. Such is democracy. The experts do not have a responsibility to keep the community safe, but we do. Experts have the luxury of being ideological. We have a responsibility to the community. We listen to all sides of the argument, but we're here at the request of the people of the Northern Territory, and our responsibility is to them. The Leader of the Opposition also claims we are struggling to talk about the recommendations from the coronial inquiry into the tragic death of 4 Aboriginal women. We are not. What we have done in looking to the recommendations is consult broadly across government and the sector to make sure we get the response right. Madam Speaker, we will not be a reactive government making assumptions. We all know what they say about people who make assumptions. We will look to ensure that funding is allocated where it will achieve the best possible outcome for the victims of domestic violence and our community as a whole. Clearly, those on the other side are selective in their commitment to have a bipartisan approach. Proposals to do things differently are put forward, and every time, Madam Speaker, they are rejected. Circuit breaker is a perfect example of that. Madam Speaker, those on the other side would have us believe that the wraparound program that is now in place, where there has been 145 young people and their families supported to take a better path before they come before the justice system, which supports them returning to school, provides referrals to support programs working to reduce domestic violence happening in their homes, showing them that violence is not the answer, is the same as the glorified taxi service they operated. It is not. Madam Speaker, while I appreciate it is early days, in Alice Springs, where circuit breaker commenced, we have seen an 11% decrease year on year in February 2025 and a 10% decrease in March 2025 in domestic assaults. In Palmerston, an area where domestic violence rose exponentially under the previous Labor government, there has been a 14% decrease year on year in February 2025 and 11% in March 2025. The only new factor in this story is circuit breaker. To suggest circuit breaker, which addresses the root causes of domestic violence, is not a domestic violence program, is irresponsible and devalues the incredible work of the frontline workers in that program, who I have had the privilege, Madam Speaker, of joining on their nightly patrols in Alice Springs on 2 occasions. They talk about post-release services. The fact is that once a perpetrator has completed their time and is released from prison, you cannot compel them to continue any form of behavioural change program or ongoing skills training. Changing adult behaviour takes more than doing a limited course and then being sent away. To really change behaviour, people need ongoing support over a period of time, something those on the other side would have known if they were listening to the sector and not just making announcements to appear to be doing something. Our CLP government, on the other hand, is working to identify how we can deliver interventions at the point of charge, supporting victims and alleged perpetrators to change behaviour, because that is where we can make the difference. Madam Speaker, those on the other side did not put community safety first. Instead, a lack of safety grew out of control under the 8 years of Labor government, where those on the other side who removed mandatory sentencing for domestic violence offences failed to hear the voice of our community, who were screaming, "Enough is enough." Every Territorian has the right to feel safe, and sentencing repeat offenders who breach a DVO will keep people safe. Madam Speaker, these amendments are critical critical to working to protect victims of domestic, family and sexual violence.
Minister, in closing.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank the members for their contributions in this debate and their support of this bill. I also want to thank the Legislative Scrutiny Committee for its careful consideration of the bill and its report that I received on the 29th of April 2025. I'm pleased to see that the committee has recommended that the bill be passed with some proposed amendments, and I will discuss those recommendations and the amendments further in my summing up. Madam Speaker, I'm very proud to have introduced and now to oversee the passing of this bill through the Legislative Assembly. These amendments will introduce crucial changes in the Northern Territory to hold DV offenders to account, to protect DV victims and provide additional funding and support to DV victims, specifically to victims of crime and also generally. Under Labor, the Northern Territory became the jurisdiction with the highest rates of domestic violence in Australia, with intimate partner homicide rates 7 times higher than the national average. Our government made a commitment before the 2024 election to reduce crime and address community safety, and this bill is a step towards achieving that commitment with respect to domestic and family violence. Domestic violence offending remains high in the Territory. It is a matter of grave concern, particularly for vulnerable members of our community. Therefore, as part of the development of this important legislation, our government listened to the community and victims who were crying out for strong government action in light of women being bashed and killed in the Territory by their partners. And as part of the consultation process, our government sent this bill to the Legislative Scrutiny Committee, where we received extensive submissions. And again, we thank everyone for taking the time to provide their input into the bill. All recommendations are broadly supported by our government, subject to some minor variations. Recommendation 1 of the Legislative Scrutiny Committee is that the bill be passed with the amendments proposed. Recommendation 2 proposes that the approved financial assistance form, lodgement process and any associated policy or guidance materials be reviewed to ensure the process is easy to navigate, flexible, simple and accessible for those who face English and digital literacy barriers or digital accessibility challenges. This recommendation will be addressed operationally by the Crimes Victims Services Unit of the Attorney-General's Department. It is intended that any new application form lodgement process will be included in a community of practice project, which the Crimes Victims Services Unit intends to commence in 2025, which will encourage and support collaborative support for victims of violent crimes. Recommendation 3 proposes Section 24 be amended to provide that the Director must not appoint a person to be an assessor for the Victims Financial Assistance Scheme unless the person has the skills, qualifications, training and experience to properly perform the role. Our government supports this recommendation, excluding the reference to qualifications, and consultation with the Crimes Victims Services Unit confirmed that there is no requirement for the word qualifications because there is no formal requirement for qualifications as the role of the assessor in the future. This has not watered down the training requirements, which is the crux of the committee's recommendation, and I will be proposing those requirements are included by way of Assembly amendment. The final recommendation, which is recommendation 4 of the committee, is that the explanatory statement be amended to clarify the policy intent of the amendments to Section 24 and explain fully the extent of the proposed amendments to Section 24. We are further amending Section 24 by Assembly amendment. Madam Speaker, I will be proposing an amendment to correct a drafting error in the commencement clause, which is clause 2. The Assembly amendment will amend the incorrect reference to Section 21 to correctly read Section 14. Section 14 amends Section 61 of the Victims of Crime Assistance Act 2006 with respect to the imposition of the Victims of Crime levy. The amendment changes monetary amounts to revenue units. It is appropriate this amendment commence on the 1st of July 2025, the start of the financial year. The Assembly amendment will ensure the correct section, which is section 14, commences on the 1st of July 2025 rather than on assent like the rest of the bill. Secondly, the Legislative Scrutiny Committee recommended the bill be passed with a further amendment to section 24 of the Victims of Crime Assistance Act 2006, which is aimed at ensuring that assessors are appropriately trained to perform their role. I will be proposing an amendment of that nature during the bill's consideration and detail stage. The new provision will include a requirement that the Director may, in writing, appoint a person to be an assessor for the financial assistance scheme if the Director is satisfied that the person has the appropriate skills, training and experience to perform the functions of an assessor. The committee also recommended the explanatory statement be amended to clarify the policy intent of the amendments to section 24 and to explain the full extent of the proposed amendments. It is common practice for the explanatory statement to mirror the bill, which was originally introduced into the Legislative Assembly, and ordinarily, if a clause is amended by an Assembly amendment, the explanatory statement is not updated. Madam Speaker, the amendments proposed in Clause 13 amend Section 24 of the Victims of Crime Assistance Act 2006. Section 24 provides for the appointment of assessors for the purpose of conducting assessments of applications for financial assistance. Currently, assessors must be appointed by the Minister and must be a lawyer. Currently, the Director can also be appointed as an assessor. Clause 13 is primarily aimed at removing the requirement that a victim of crime assessor be a lawyer. The new provision specifies the person who are considered assessors for the financial assistance scheme, and these will still include the Director of Crimes Victim Special Units, the Victim Crimes Services Unit, a person authorised under the Law Officers Act 1978 to act in the name of the Solicitor for the Northern Territory generally, which means the lawyers within the Office of the Solicitor for the Northern Territory, and a person appointed by the Director of the Crimes Victims Services Unit under subsection 2. Subsection 2, as amended by the Assembly amendment, will allow the Director of the Crimes Victims Services Unit to appoint a person in writing to be an assessor for the financial assistance scheme if the Director is satisfied that the person has the appropriate skills and training and experience to perform the functions of an assessor. The requirement that assessors are lawyers has been removed. The requirement that additional assessors are appointed by the Minister has also been removed. The Director may now appoint assessors, provided they are satisfied the person has the skills, training and experience to perform the role. These amendments in Section 24 of the Victims of Crime Assistance Act 2006 will broaden the scope of available assessors, allowing flexibility within the Crimes Victims Services Unit to address variations in the numbers of claims at any one time. The crux of the Legislative Scrutiny Committee's recommendation is that the assessors satisfy necessary training requirements, and this is addressed by the Assembly amendment. Madam Speaker, domestic and family violence grew out of control under 8 years of Labor, who removed mandatory sentencing for domestic violence offences and put the rights of victims beneath the rights of offenders. The reintroduction of mandatory sentencing is a clear indication of our government and our commitment to addressing domestic and family violence. Madam Speaker, examples of how these new mandatory sentencing laws will work in practice are as follows. Where an offender has a DVO placed on them and they then proceed to text the victim, call the victim and turn up at the victim's house either in a single day or over the course of a few days or weeks, then those multiple breaches of the DVO will be brought before the court and the offender will be sentenced to actual imprisonment, so they understand the court takes these orders seriously and that the offender gets the message. In this example, that offender now has a history of breaching their DVO. So if they breach their DVO again, they are captured by mandatory sentencing and they are once again required to serve actual imprisonment and will face even longer in prison. Finally, if an offender breaches their DVO and threatens to harm the victim or actually causes harm to the victim, then they are facing a maximum prison sentence of 5 years and once again actual imprisonment. With the passing of these new laws, the Northern Territory will have the strongest and robust mandatory sentencing domestic and family violence laws in the nation. These new laws will ensure offenders are put behind bars, and when the offender is behind bars, Madam Speaker, the victim is safe. Madam Speaker, some of the criticism from the opposition is that mandatory sentencing is not an evidence-based approach to deterring DV offending, that mandatory sentencing does not work, and that deterrence of crime through punishment does not work. However, data suggests otherwise. In a study produced by the Western Australian Law Reform Commission, which looked at the effectiveness of the Western Australian mandatory sentencing laws for certain property crimes, data shows a 40% reduction in car theft and a 30% decrease in break-ins. Clearly, that is working. In addition, a study produced by Dr. 𝑨𝑮𝑻 in the Netherlands entitled Preventing Crime Through Selective Incapacitation tracked criminal laws implemented by the Netherlands, allowing for significantly longer prison sentences, up to 10 times the usual duration for offenders with a history of multiple offences. The study found that cities that applied the law experienced a 25% reduction in theft rates, with the most intensive applications leading up to a 40% decrease. This is evidence that punishing offenders does lead to a decrease in crime. Our government understands that DV is often shaped by many complex factors like trauma, substance abuse, poverty, and emotional and mental health issues. What our mandatory sentencing laws mean is that if an offender breaches a DVO, they will receive a term of actual imprisonment. That sentence of imprisonment can include an intensive community corrections order, which can mandate that an offender undertakes behavioural programs and rehabilitation. This is why we have given the court the tools to send high-risk and repeat offenders to prison, where they can engage in programs when inside and once out as part of their sentence. They will continue to be required to engage in programs by the court and intensively case managed to reduce risk of offending and risk to the victim. With this approach, we have balanced consequences with rehabilitation. This is in addition to the funding allocation to the Circuit Breaker program, which includes $6.6 million ongoing, which will tackle these root causes, as well as our $12.9 million boost to boost school attendances through the School Attendance Officer program, and our $3 million allocated for the school-based police program. Madam Speaker, I've heard members today talk about payback and the risk of offenders reoffending on release, and I refute the idea that we cannot hold offenders accountable for their actions because they may reoffend. The truth is they're already reoffending. What the opposition is saying is don't hold violent offenders accountable because that will make them even angrier for the inconvenience of having to be held accountable and go to prison. This is not a criticism that I take seriously. We will not be dictated to by these violent offenders and keep these vulnerable women in a culture of silence through violence. This type of criticism was sadly put forward by many, and to them I say that they may need to reevaluate their outlook on this issue, because recommending that we don't punish offenders because the offenders might then hurt their victims more is allowing victims to be held at ransom by violent thugs, and we will not allow that to happen. If the offender is behind bars, the victim cannot be hurt and has the opportunity to get a better situation and to seek help and support. And Madam Speaker, the logic is simple. If the offender is behind bars, the victim is safe. And our increased support of victims' services and support will ensure victims are safe even when the offender is released.
Opposition Leader, please be quiet.
Madam Speaker, our government is ensuring that the court has the tools to send high-risk and repeat DV offenders to prison, but that's just one part. As a government, we've invested more in offender programs in our short time in government than Labor did over 8 years. Through corrections, we have focused on offender rehabilitation and engagement through the Family Violence Program. When in custody, and we have seen 103 completions of this program, which is more than when Labor was in government. In addition, we have seen much greater engagement in the RAGE program, a 6-month-long intensive domestic family violence program with 41 completions versus 12 when Labor were in government over the same time. Madam Speaker, what we know also keeps victims safe is when they are armed with more knowledge about their offender, not less knowledge. And this is why our bill will expand the type of information that the Victims Register can receive from the Crime Victims Service Unit. Before our amendment, the information made available to the Victims Register was only in relation to an offender who is sentenced to a term of imprisonment. Our amendment to the Act expands its application and removes the reference to a term of imprisonment, ensuring it will also apply to sentences which do not result in an imprisonment, and importantly, will also apply to breaches of orders. What this means is that when an offender breaches their parole, suspended sentence, which might include breaching of electronic monitoring condition, then that information can be shared with the victim, who can then take additional precautions and is not left in the dark. Madam Speaker, we're also making offenders pay by increasing the levy for guilty offenders up to 40% to bolster funds for victim services. These amendments will also cover victims of non-domestic violence related crimes. Madam Speaker, I want to thank all the members for their responses and contributions in this debate. I also want to thank all of those first responders, especially the police, the ambulance officers like the first aid officers, and all the hard-working people in the domestic and family violence space. These are the people on the front line of this issue, and they deserve our acknowledgement. I also want to thank the Attorney General's Department for all of the work on this important bill. Madam Speaker, I might just respond to a couple of the comments made by some of the members in the House during this debate. And I do want to remind those who opposed mandatory sentencing, and in particular those in the Labor opposition, and the opposition leaders specifically, who smugly pretend that they hold all the truth as to what works and what doesn't. Remember, you had 8 years. You applied your approach to this issue and you left the territory with the highest rates of domestic violence in Australia. An intimate partner homicide rates 7 times higher than the national average, and yet you still pretend that you have all the answers, which is absolutely ridiculous. Unfortunately, it seems that Labor and the Leader of the Opposition remain committed to protecting ideology more than lives, which is why we're in this mess. The Leader of the Opposition has no credibility on this argument, and she can pretend she has the evidence. However, the evidence we have is that under her government, under her watch, DV exploded in the Northern Territory. Madam Speaker, I thank the member for 𝘼𝙗𝙇, who I note rightly pointed out that for years Labor spoke in soft words and used soft hands when dealing with crime and domestic violence. As the member for 𝘼𝙗𝙇 stated, police data shows that over the last decade there was a 117% increase in domestic violence-related calls. That is a failure of Labor, who clearly lost control of the issue. Madam Speaker, Labor love to talk in vague terms as their evidence-based approach, but offer nothing. He also pointed out the Pareto principle of criminal offenders and evidence which shows that the percentage of high-risk criminal offenders in a community is generally very small, typically estimated to be between 1% and 5% of the population. So he said by targeting this small percentage of repeat high-risk DV offenders, which our laws are designed to do, our mandatory sentencing laws will naturally reduce crime and provide a much-needed circuit breaker for the victim to get to a safer position and away from the offender. Madam Speaker, the member for 𝘼𝙗𝙇 stated that mandatory sentencing does not work because the offender may only be sent to prison for 7 days or 14 days, and that is not enough time to engage with programs. And that's why we don't have a minimum of 7 days or 14 days, because this isn't the case, and we provide the courts the tools to hold these offenders accountable. And it also includes an increase of the maximum sentence of 5 years for the most serious DV breaches. And with our investment in corrections and behaviour programs, that's what will ensure that we get the offenders the treatment that they require. Madam Speaker, the member for Nightcliff made an impassioned address to the chamber, and I am sorry to hear how she was a victim of domestic violence, and that is awful, absolutely. But I didn't appreciate her just assuming that nobody else in this chamber has ever experienced what she has experienced or knows what it's like to go through. I think that's just a making an assumption and a judgment call. She doesn't know the members intimately in this chamber, so she doesn't actually know who's been through what. So I think she should hold those kind of remarks to herself. Madam Speaker, the member for Mulka talked about peacekeepers, and I enjoyed his contribution because I've been out to the Community Justice Centre, and I know they also talked about how the member for Johnston used to do some work out there as well, and I think those kind of programs are great, and they are actually federally funded. And I believe that there is some allocation of money going towards the Community Justice Centre, so I think that they do some great work, and I think we should keep fighting for that funding, which will help those types of communities be able to interact with each other to prevent.
Can you pause, please, Minister? Opposition Leader, please refrain from talking, chatting. You're in the chamber. This is a professional context. We don't want to hear this ongoing commentary from the sideline. Minister, you've got the call. Thank
you, Madam Speaker, because this morning when the Leader of the Opposition had her contributions, we all sat very respectfully listening to that contribution, and so it is quite rude, and I thank you for pulling it up. Madam Speaker, I also thank members for Drysdale, for Blaine, member for Catherine, who's also our Education Minister. I think she spoke at length about some of the shelters that are in her community and how well they work and how she's looking forward to seeing them get some extra support. I mean, the Minister for Prevention of Domestic Violence continually talks about all of the work that she's been doing in that prevention space, and I believe she even mentioned the statistics in mandatory sentencing, the changes of the statistics when Labor removed mandatory sentencing. It went from a number and then they removed it, and it increased exponentially, which just goes to show that this whole argument that mandatory sentencing doesn't work is preposterous. So, Madam Speaker, I also heard some of the members say, and apologies for not remembering exactly which ones they were, but the mandatory sentencing won't keep the community safe. And I reject that outright. And as I've said many times, the logic is simple. If the offender is in prison, the offender cannot hurt the victim. And the victim has time to get into a better position and out of harm's way. Madam Speaker, it's obvious that in relation to mandatory sentencing, we will agree to disagree. And you can't, like the Labor opposition and some of the crossbenchers come at a position of ideology, but I approach the position as saving lives, Madam Speaker. So with that said, I now move for the bill to be read a third time.
The question is the bill be now read a second time.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. We'll read it a second time. Those of that opinion say aye, to the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The clerk.
A bill for an act to amend the Domestic and Family Violence Act 2007, the Domestic and Family Violence Regulations 2008, the Victims of Crime Assistance Act 2006, the Victims of Crime Rights and Services Act 2006, and the Victims of Crime Rights and Services Regulations 2010.
Minister.
Madam Speaker, I seek leave to move the third reading.
Is leave granted?
No. Aye.
Leave is not granted. We will move into the consideration in detail stage.
Order. The Assembly will consider the Domestic and Family Violence and Victims Legislation Amendment Bill 2025, Serial 22, together with the amendment schedule numbered 022 GOV, circulated by the Attorney-General. I'm conscious that the Attorney-General has some clauses with the amendments on. Can people want to give me any indication of any particular clause they wish to talk to?
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Clauses 5 and clauses 6.
Clauses 5 and clauses 6. Any others? No? Okay. So the question is that clause 1 stand as printed. Those of that opinion say aye, to the contrary no. I think the ayes have it. The question is that clause 2 stand as printed. Attorney-General.
Mr Deputy Speaker, the Assembly amendment will clause 2 will omit all references 21 and insert 14. This clause sets out how the Amendment Act will be commenced other than section 14, and commencement will be on the day after the day on which the administrator's assent to this Act is declared. Section 14 commences on the 1st of July 2025.
Thank you, Minister. Are there any speakers on the amendment?
Oh, I forgot to say I moved it. Do you want me to say I moved the amendment? I move the amendment to clause 2 of the bill.
Yep. Are there any speakers? Right, the question is that the amendment be agreed to. Those that have opinion say aye, to the contrary no. Aye. I think the ayes have it. The question is that clause 2 stand as amended. Those that opinion say aye, to the contrary no. I think the ayes have it. Question is that clauses 3 to 4 stand as printed. Those that opinion say aye, to the contrary no.
Mr Deputy Speaker, be considered together.
Oh, be considered together, sorry. Yep. Okay, there being no objection, the question is that clauses 3 and 4 stand as printed. Those that opinion say aye, to the contrary no. Aye. I think the ayes are. The question is that clause 5 stand as printed. Those that opinion say aye, to the contrary no. No. Member for 𝘼𝑗𝑎.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Attorney-General, in your closing speech, you made reference to the evidence and the data. Are you able to confirm what that evidence and data was that has made the government follow the position of introducing mandatory sentencing?
Thank you for the question. The evidence is look at the crime statistics, look at the number of victims that we have, look at the fact that our domestic and family violence perpetrators have not been dealt with over a long time. So now this Act has been brought in to deal with that. So
I seek to confirm your data set is perception-based. There is no quantitative or qualitative data that has been undertaken by the Attorney-General's Department to indicate that the reintroduction of mandatory sentencing will drive down the Northern Territory crime statistics in this space.
The crime statistic data, your data from when you removed mandatory sentencing, points to the fact that there were more offences after mandatory sentencing was removed. So there is some data and evidence to point to that shows you why we're bringing it back.
So there's no comprehensive, individualised data that actually can monitor whether or not the removal of mandatory sentencing in 2022 legislation comparable with the legislation now. There's no data that's been commissioned to determine and look at those statistics. It's just the whole of crime stats that you're basing this analysis on.
Those crime stats are very specific to domestic violence crime stats, so that data is irrefutable, that it's evidence that there's there.
So whereabouts does it highlight the mandatory sentencing component of those particular crime statistics?
Like I said, there is domestic violence crime statistics that show what they were before mandatory sentencing was repealed and then and how they went up. But I do feel like I've answered the question. It doesn't specifically go to the clause either.
Thank you, Attorney-General. I just want to make the point, I was seeking clarification if the government's position had been based on what was referenced by yourself being data from Western Australia and the Netherlands, not the Northern Territory.
They were reports that I was referring to based on the incapacitation of people and how it's dealt with when they are a crime, when they're criminals or not.
Thank you. Just wanting to also acknowledge that, as we've all spoken about, your own minister has said crime stats will rise in domestic and family violence when people feel comfortable to report. So there should in fact be an increase. Mr Deputy Speaker, I seek clarification as well. The Attorney-General, you spoke about the provisions of minimum and maximum terms of imprisonment. There is no minimum term of imprisonment, so confirmation that someone could be sentenced to prison for 1 day or for a period of up to 5 years, correct?
Yes.
So the court, the judiciary under these changes, could send someone to prison for a day, correct?
Yes.
And in relation to 78CB of the Sentencing Act 1995, we talk about terms of imprisonment. Just to be super clear, Attorney-General, that is only the court can look at prison, not an alternative to custody facility.
So they can actually receive a term of imprisonment in the community, such as a community order, which potentially could be alternative to custody, but also an intensive corrections order as well.
Thank you, Attorney. So just, sorry, to be clear, someone is before the court, the judiciary looks at a term of imprisonment under 78CB of the Sentencing Act, when we're talking about term of imprisonment, that could be a work order or an enforced corrections order, or someone could be sentenced to an alternative to custody facility as part of that. Wouldn't necessarily be the Darwin Correctional Centre, the Alice Springs, or Datchula or Barclay. Could be other examples.
It could be, but also there'd be some strict conditions with that sentence.
Yep, thank you. And Attorney-General, just again wanting to inquire, this particular part around the repeal of mandatory sentencing was work undertaken by the Northern Territory's Law Reform Committee. Were they consulted on the reintroduction of mandatory sentencing for this particular provision?
No.
Thank you.
Member for Johnson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can you explain how this amendment will ensure that misidentified victims will not be imprisoned?
Member for Johnston, under the last government, this was an issue which was actually picked up, and so early on in the piece now, there are mechanisms in place to ensure that misidentification doesn't occur.
To clarify, you're saying that there is no misidentification of victims?
The process they use is that...
Sorry, point of order. Deputy Chairman.
Relevant to the clause, we're talking about for opinions here. This is like we need relevant to the clause, which is about mandatory.
A smart woman, she can answer for herself.
Shut up.
Hey, sorry, stop that language. Withdraw that. Please, Deputy Chief Minister, withdraw that.
Withdraw that.
Thank you. Look, I do take the point. Member for Johnson, we are talking about Clause 5, which is about mandatory sentencing for contravention of DVOs. It's up to the Minister if she wishes to take the question.
Yeah. I mean, everyone's right, it doesn't go to the clause, but my understanding of the problem that used to be with misidentification was picked up in a previous term of government, and there's a lot of work that's been put into that, but it all happens quite early in the piece instead of at the ordering time or the sentencing time.
Member for Johnson.
So to go to the clause, you're can I ask, are you confident that misidentified victims will not be imprisoned under this mandatory sentencing law?
Point of order. You can't ask for an opinion. It's about relevant to the clause.
Once again, I'll just give the Minister the option whether she
I'm happy
takes
to
it on.
reword.
It is very hypothetical and subjective. I mean, it could happen with any kind of case potentially, but our courts, go through a very thorough process to ensure that everybody has the right identification.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Johnson.
Can you outline what rehabilitation programs and people imprisoned under this Act will have access to?
Yeah. Look, I do take the point again, and I have reminded the member for Johnson, this is Clause 5. Can we stick to Clause 5 specifically?
Okay.
No further questions? The question... Oh, sorry. No. The question... sorry. The question is that Clause 5 stand as printed. Those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. No. I think the ayes have it. Division called. Division supported. Ring the bells. The division is ayes 17, noes 7. Clause 5 stands as printed. The question is that Clause 6 stand as printed. Those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. 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 Leader of the opposition. Oh, sorry. Member for 𝘼𝙄𝙇.
Speaker. Just in relation to Clause 6, the transitional matters for domestic and family violence and victims legislation amendment, Attorney, just stepping through the process around the commencement of this bill upon passage will be the process in which all current matters before the court will be dealt with, if currently active, before that.
Sorry.
No,
No, we're on
to
clause 6.
we passed that.
Continue, Member for 𝘼𝙄𝙇.
So, sorry, Attorney General. Again, that question was just the matters that are currently before court. This legislation, obviously, passage will come. Those matters will be dealt with under the pre-existing conditions.
Yes.
Thank you. So, just to be clear, when you say yes, Attorney General, that's any person who has been charged and has a court date set will be under the new conditions if they haven't appeared before court yet, or the old conditions?
Member for 𝘼𝙄𝙇, Section 122 will apply only in relation to the sentencing of an offender for an offence committed after the commencement.
Great. So all matters that are currently before in terms of having been charged by police will be dealt with under the legislation as it is, say, today. And then following that, Attorney, all matters, once the bill has passed and has been gazetted, will be under the reintroduction of mandatory sentencing provisions.
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
No further questions. The question is that Clause 6 stand as printed. Those of that opinion say aye, to the contrary no.
No.
I think the ayes have it. Is it supported?
Yes.
Ring the bells. Division called. Is 17 ayes, 7 noes. The ayes have it. Is it the wish of the Assembly that clauses 7 to 12 be considered together? There be no objection. It is so ordered. The question is that clauses 7 to 12 stand as printed. Those that opinion say aye, to the contrary no. The ayes have it. The question is that clause 13 stand as printed. Those that opinion say aye, to the contrary no. Ms. Deputy Speaker, Attorney General.
I move an amendment to clause 13, subsection 2 of the bill, which replaces proposed subsection 2 of the section 24 of the Victims of Crime Assistance Act 2006. With the amended version, omit insert, the director may, in writing, appoint a person to be an assessor for the financial assistance scheme if the director is satisfied that the person has the appropriate skills, training and experience to perform the functions of an assessor.
Thank you, Attorney General. Are there any speakers?
Sorry, Mr Deputy Speaker, can I just clarify, no issue with the Attorney General's amendment, but we'll have a few questions to the clause. So will we just vote on the amended, vote to amend the clause now, and then we can still ask questions in clause 13, or should we ask them now? Yeah, well, we've got no issue with the amendment, but we still want to speak to the clause.
Yeah, now may be the time. Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. No problem. As I said, thank you, Attorney General, with the amendment that you circulated this morning, which you've just read out. Attorney General, why remove the requirement for that legal qualification?
Leader of the Opposition, there will still be lawyers of the Solicitor for Northern Territory. It just makes it easier for the director to appoint other people who are appropriately skilled, trained or have experience in assessing.
Thank you, Minister. And the next question relates to your answer. Who is eligible to become an assessor, and is there specific criteria to be eligible?
Leader of the Opposition, this amendment does address that specific question.
Can I just confirm if there was a reference, the copy of the amendment I have, Attorney, doesn't have a criteria?
It says if the director is satisfied that the person has the appropriate skills, training and experience to perform the functions of an assessor. That's the criteria.
Yeah, but what is the actual assessor criteria? So obviously someone needs to be satisfied to be a assessor, granted to be an assessor, but what is the director basing that satisfaction on?
Leader of the Opposition, I do feel like I've answered it, but I just want to point out that this was a recommendation from the from the Scrutiny Committee, and so I had a look at it and agreed with those recommendations and decided to amend that particular part of the Act.
Thank you, Attorney. So there's still no criteria set out, because I didn't see the Scrutiny Committee produce a criteria for the director to grant an assessor.
The director can apply the criteria based around the appropriate skills, training and experience to perform those functions, and the director can make that call themselves.
Thank you. So I know, and Mr Deputy Speaker, with respect, I don't want to go round in circles, and I certainly don't want to waste anyone's time, but is there a criteria that we can look at for future reference?
I'll just answer one more time. Just to be clear, we're not going to legislate that criteria, but that'll be up to the director to create whatever operational decisions they want to make.
Thank you. And yes, appreciate that. Where would someone find it? In case someone wanted to become an assessor, where would they find that to know that they have the opportunity to apply to be eligible?
They could contact the director of the Crimes Victims Services Unit.
So could just a mate then be appointed because there's someone satisfactory, or is there a set criteria, and how would that be available to the public?
It would be a person that's employed by the Solicitor for Northern Territory, so yeah, I'm not sure what you're getting at, but I think I've answered the question.
Thank you. It was just the legal qualifications now removed, and obviously to have a legal qualification you would have a law degree to then be an assessor. I'm just trying to understand how would an assessor be considered satisfactory if there's no criteria, hence no legal requirement now, so no law degree required. So what is the criteria for someone to be an assessor?
Leader of the Opposition, just for clarity, to help with answering this question, those CVSU officers, of course, are well trained, and sometimes they are more proficient in the area of victims of crime financial assistance assessments than many lawyers. It is appropriate that they are made eligible to be appointed assessors.
Okay, and they would just need to talk to the director to be considered eligible.
That would be part of the recruitment process.
Leader of the Opposition.
Last time I'll ask it, but if there's a recruitment process, there's often a criteria that's set for that recruitment process to find someone satisfactory or not satisfactory. How would someone then become satisfactory if there's no criteria for that recruitment process to the director?
That will be part of what the director does in their day-to-day work. It's definitely not legislation, and I'm not going to dictate to that director how they should and shouldn't apply. All the other stuff is set out in legislation, which is the minimum.
Thank you, Attorney.
Thank you, Attorney. What training will they undergo, given the complexity of some of the decisions, as you've already outlined, in which they'll be making? So, for example, Minister, would this include interpreting legislation and weighing evidence, because there's no criteria now for that legal requirement through the amendment?
That would be up to the director, and it's an administrative function that they would work through.
Thank you, and thank you through the chair. Minister, how will they be monitored to ensure that they are performing as expected in the assessor role?
They would report to the director, and the director would manage their performance like any other director would of their staff.
No further questions. The question is, sorry? The question is that clause 13 stand as amended. Those that opinion say aye, to the contrary no. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay, so let's just go back a bit. The question is that the amendment be agreed to. Those that opinion say aye, to the contrary no. Aye. The ayes have it. The question is that clause 13 stand as amended. Those that opinion say aye, to the contrary no. Aye. I think the ayes have it. Okay. Is it the wish of the Assembly that the remainder of the bill be taken together? There's no? Clause 14? Okay. Question is that clause 14 stand as printed. Those that opinion say aye, to the contrary no. No. Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, who have you consulted with about the imposition of the levy?
So, Opposition Leader, a few things. This particular part moves it from the percentages to the dollar figure in revenue units, but also this is in line with today's monetary. Like, it hasn't been reviewed for such a long time. It's well overdue to be looked at. I mean, we've got CPI, inflation, all the rest. So that's why this decision was made to increase it.
Leader of the
Opposition. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, we understand from the briefing received from the Attorney-General's Department that there will be a significant increase. Can you confirm what that increase is for the penalty in the conversion?
Based on our calculations, it's about 40%.
And thank you, Minister. What would that be in dollar figures?
Just get my calculator. Leader of the Opposition, I don't have a total because it would depend on the types of cases and how many are going through. As an example, I could talk about the revenue units that move from like 200 revenue units, which equals about $290 up from $200. Do you want me to, I can go through a list of them if you wish, if you want to write them down. So 150 revenue units equal to $217.50, up from $150. 50 revenue units equal to $72.50, up from $50. 1,000 revenue units equal to $1,450, up from $1,000. 40 revenue units equal to $58 and up from $40.
Thank you, Minister. Very much appreciated. In terms of the specialist services supporting victims of crime, will these revenue units then convert to those specialist services?
Going from money to a percentage, not about where that money is going to go.
Look, I'll let the Minister decide whether she'll answer or not.
It's about supporting victims, Deputy Chief Minister. You'd think you'd want to hear the answer.
Attorney General, your
I
call.
will say that we have put $15 million in the budget towards the victims' services, and so of course the money that we generate from these levies would go towards those.
Thank you, Minister. But would this then increase the pool for victim services, so then more victims of crime would then be able to access better services?
Point of order, 155, relevant to the clause, we're talking about converting from monetary amounts to revenues, not where that money is going to be spent.
Thank you. Look, I take the point of order, and we do need to be relevant to the clause, but I will, as I said, I'll leave it to the Minister's discretion. If she doesn't want to answer it, that's fine.
Leader of the Opposition, that is the intention of that fund.
Thank you. It's great to hear that, and hopefully the Deputy Chief Minister appreciates your work, Attorney General.
He does.
Mr Deputy Chair, the next question is around victim survivors. What other changes do you foresee around the scheme? Because we know that there's some other services that could also happen with some of the work that you've been doing.
Point of order, Deputy Chief Minister.
We're talking about clause 14, converting monetary amounts to revenue units, not about what other schemes that may be provided.
That's all right.
I'll take
She
the
wants
point
to
of order.
answer, she can. Let her just go.
Are there any further questions? Any further questions?
Oh, sorry, no answer.
It doesn't go to the clause.
Okay, there being no further questions. The question is that clause 14 stand as printed. Those of that opinion say aye, to the contrary no. I think the ayes have it. Are there any other further clauses that people want to be specific about? If not, is it the wish of the Assembly that the remainder of the bill be taken together? There being no objection, it is so ordered. The question is that the remainder of the bill stand as printed. Those of that opinion say aye, to the contrary no. Aye. I think the ayes have it. The question is that the bill be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye, to the contrary no. I think the ayes have it. No. Fair enough. So, Minister? Third reading?
Mr Deputy Speaker, I move that the bill now be read a third time.
The question is that the bill be read a third time. Those of that opinion say aye, to the contrary no. I think the ayes have it.
No.
Clerk.
A bill for an act to amend the Domestic and Family Violence Act 2007.
Sorry.
I said no.
Sorry, we've moved on. I'm sorry, Member for Johnson.
Excuse me, I said no.
Yeah. So the ayes have it, that's right. Yeah.
Not moved on, that's a rude way to deal with legislation.
Continue, Clerk.
A bill for an act to amend the Domestic and Family Violence Act 2007, the Domestic and Family Violence Regulation 2008, the Victims of Crime Assistance Act 2006, Victims of Crime Rights and Services Act 2006, and the Victims of Crime Rights and Services Regulations 2010.